Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dirk and I would like to welcome you to another jointly event hosted by KGAL, Watson, Farley and Williams. Our topic today is sustainable aviation fuels, and we are really excited about the huge interest.
Also from my side, a very warm welcome. And indeed, Tom, the interest is enormous. I've just checked with IT, and we have more than 470 participants in this webinar with this, which is extraordinary. And that would have been unthinkable some time ago. And it shows that a niche topic like SAF has moved to the center of interest of the aviation sector. Therefore, we are very pleased that for today's event, we have an excellent group of speakers to discuss the SAF market, the opportunities and challenges. A big thank you, therefore, in particular to our external guests, Amy Herbert from Arcadia, who's joining from the US, Jan Pechstein from Lufthansa,
Dr. Holger Haaf from Uniper, Margot Touré from Sky Energy, joining from Amsterdam, and Maximilian Held from Systemic.
And of course, finally, Antoine Dupuis from KGAL and my fellow partner, Maximilian Böhmke from Watson, Farley and Williams. We are looking forward to your presentations and to an exciting discussions thereafter on the panel. Before we start, please let us briefly introduce ourselves. Tom, do you like to start?
Yes, thank you so much, Dirk. My name is Thomas Engelmann. I'm heading the energy transition team at KGAL. What is energy transition? I think this is exactly what we are doing. And before I do this and explaining energy transition, it's much easier to explain what is KGAL doing. KGAL has 3 asset classes. KGAL is a financial asset manager. And here, very important, KGAL has an asset class, aviation, and the aviation team has managed it to have more than 700 airline deals done. And on the other hand side, we have sustainable infrastructure. That means our team has always a 1.5 gigawatt investment capacity on solar and wind. What is energy transition? Energy transition stands in between, and this is our team. We are investing with KGAL and with our money from our investors into the market, what we discuss. eSAF is one part of that.
Thank you, Tom. Just a few words about Watson, Farley and Williams for those of you who don't know us yet. We are an international law firm with more than 200 partners and 700 lawyers worldwide. We operate through 19 offices in 14 jurisdictions. I am a partner in the Munich office of Watson Farley, and I'm specialized in the M&A and private equity piece of the transactions we are advising on. What differentiates us from our peers is that we follow a very clear sector focus. That means we advise on complex transactions in our core sectors, which are all highly regulated, being energy, infrastructure, and transport. And within our transport sector, we have a very strong aviation practice. For example, we are the only law firm advising the aviation working group and aviation industry bodies in their negotiation with the European Commission on the EU taxonomy of aviation. This understanding of the aviation sector, combined with our experience and expertise in the energy sector, where we have, for example, dedicated teams that advise on hydrogen projects, we believe that we are very well placed to advise within the whole value chain of the aviation market, of the SAF market. Like we did on Project Endor, where we had the big pleasure to advise Tom and his team on the investment of ESPF 6 in a large-scale SAF project in Vordingborg, Denmark. This project will be developed by Arcadia, so I believe Amy Herbert from Arcadia will elaborate a little bit more on that later on. But I mention it because during this transaction, the idea to hosting this webinar was born. When we started with this project and we sat down and discussed the transaction structure and started to design it, a lot of questions arose because this was the first of its kind project. So we thought, how can we make such a project bankable? How can we de-risk the investment of ESPF 6 what do we need to get to FID? What are the obstacles from a regulatory perspective and a technical perspective? So we are looking forward to discussing many of these points also with you today.
Yeah, dear valuable guests, all participants to have the opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A tool. We will collect and introduce them during our roundtable discussions. It is likely that we can potentially not deal with all questions, but we are really happy to get in touch with you after today's webinar to further discuss. Okay, let's start. Let's ready for takeoff. Then we would love to introduce our first speaker. It's Antoine Tupy. He is in my team, and I really be very excited to have him on board. Why? He is really a fellow of energy transition. He has more than 10 years experience in the aviation part, worked with Airbus. And on the other hand side, as a mechanical engineer, he knows the energy markets because he served also for BayWa, RE, and also for us in KGAL, and now in my team, in the energy transition team. The show is yours, Antoine.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Dirk. Thank you very much, and hello, dear audience. Very happy to be here today. Perfect, let's see if it works. Yes. I will take you through today to a technical introduction on sustainable aviation fuels. And I would like to start with one saying, which I used to hear a lot while I was in the aviation industry from 10 to 20 years ago. And this saying was that the last drop of oil would once be used in an aircraft. Now, what this tells us, I think it tells us a lot about the mindset back then, and basically says two things. The first is that everybody knew that it would take aviation probably the longest time to manage its decarbonization. And that secondly, there was absolutely no plan B back then. So where are we today? I think we all have clear in mind the COVID crisis, which is only 3 to 4 years ago. And it struck the aviation industry really hard, bringing aviation traffic almost down to zero. And this coincided also with the time where the global public, I think, raised its climate conscious, and the aviation sector also had to think a lot how to adapt. It's also the time when the EU pressed the acceleration button and became more serious about decarbonization targets, and this is what Max Böhmke later will show us. And so where do we stand today? IATA is telling us that 2024 is about to be an absolute record year in terms of aviation traffic. And we expect up to 5 billion air travelers to fly this year. And IATA also tells us that this number is about to double within the next 20 years. So what this means is that the challenge of decarbonization for aviation is even more urgent than we thought. However, there's new ideas in mind now. I think that's the big difference with 20 years ago. And so where are we here? What can we envisage? You have probably all heard of the hydrogen-powered aircraft coming, let's say, soon, but not so soon. In fact, the COVID crisis is also the moment where aircraft manufacturers, such as Airbus, started talking about the hydrogen aircraft for the first time. And Airbus is giving 2035, let's say, as announced deadline to bring its first commercial aircraft to the market. However, we know for sure that this will be a short-haul aircraft. So in the A320 size, probably in the best case. And it is clear also that we'll have to wait another 10 to 15 years before the first long-haul aircraft can really fly on hydrogen. So what about electrification? That's one of these buzzwords in the energy transition, right? So the first electrically powered aircraft are actually coming now very soon on the market. The first prototypes are flying. We've all heard of these vertical takeoff landing, helicopter-like aircraft. There's also some ideas around H2 fuel cell. I'm thinking here of Zero Avia and also Lilium Jet, for instance, for the electrically powered aircraft. However, here we're talking definitely of smaller aircraft, maybe maximum 15 to 20 seaters. And here it is clear as well that it will require significant progress in battery technology to envisage electrification on medium-haul aviation. So what to do? And this is actually where the SAFs come into the game. The great advantage of SAFs, and you've understood we have a timing issue here, is that they are drop-in fuels. What does this mean? It basically means that you can use them from tomorrow on conventional aircraft without having to adapt the engine technology. So this is obviously a great advantage. And in fact, aviation certification authorities already allow up to 50% of SAF blending. And this is more than enough for the next 10 to 15 years. One thing also to keep in mind when trying to introduce a new technology in aviation is what do we do with the fueling industry or the infrastructure, and especially also the airport infrastructure. I remember how much of a challenge it was for the airports to accommodate the A380 more than 15 years ago. They had to reinforce runways and adopt the docking infrastructure. This was really also a great challenge. And if this doesn't match, if this doesn't work, then you can forget introducing new technology, right? The other thing to keep in mind when considering the various options is that fleet renewables and conventional aircraft phase-out was stretched over decades. Why is that? It takes around 5 to 8 years for an aircraft manufacturer to bring a new technology. And that's when we speak of incremental development. And aircraft are usually designed for a design lifetime of 20 to 30 years. Now, we can all assume that airlines are not willing to see their fleet stranded and send them to the Mojave Desert from one day to the next year. So we'll have to cope with these flying aircraft, these conventional aircraft, for a few decades from now. So the question the option to have drop-in fuels for these aircraft is an absolute solution. So in a nutshell, what we could say is that SAFs offer aviation a bridge to reduce its emissions before overcoming the technological leap to decarbonization. Now, what are SAFs exactly? Sustainable aviation fuels. I'd like to give you a simplified but however accurate view on the different families of SAF which are available and how to recognize these different types and understand what options they are good for. On the left-hand side, you can see the most known family today, which is the BioSAF family, and as its name says, it's originated from biomass. And you can see that we have three different, at least on this picture, three different types which are being shown here. And the difference are on the feedstocks they are using, but as well on the processes they require. So we have the HEFA SAFs, and HEFA stands for hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. These are the SAFs that most of you have probably most heard of. Most of the time when you read a press release about SAF, and which is not really going more specific here, what is meant behind is BioSAF, and what is most probably meant, because they make up 80% of this type, are bio-HEFA SAFs. So they require used oils from the food industry, and they can accommodate various blends of fats. However, we will see later that the feedstocks are not unlimited here. And it is clear that although we can sometimes read that everything would be fine to use these cheaper SAFs to cover the complete demand. However, this is not possible. So we will be forced sooner or later, and better do it sooner, to look at other SAF types. Shortly finishing here on biosafs, you can see the other routes depicted here. One of them is using Fischer-Tropsch process. Fischer-Tropsch basically requires biomass gasification. So you heat up biomass and produce a syngas from that, which is a mix of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And Fischer-Tropsch, the Fischer-Tropsch reactor would refine this syngas and produce required hydrocarbons before being hydrocracked and sorted out. One other way to produce biosaf is alcohol to jet, but I will not go into the details here. So let's go to our on the right-hand side to the other type of SAF we're considering today, which are the eSAF. E stands for electric. We could also call them synthesis fuels or RFNBOs, as per the EU RED II and RED III directives, and this stands for renewable fuels of non-biological origin. So the name says it all already. What we require here as feedstocks is only water, green electricity, and biogenic CO2. What is actually biogenic CO2? Here is a bit of a trick, or it takes some attention to actually understand what lies behind, because not all sources of CO2 are acceptable, and this is being defined in RED II and RED III directives. But to give you an example, we could use CO2, which is originated from a bio-based process, such as biogas production. And in this case, this CO2 has been previously caught by vegetation and would be typically released to the atmosphere as a waste product. So the thing we do here is, we could say we recycle the CO2 of biogenic origin and inject it into the process. And this is looking at the Fischer-Tropsch process here. Again, this is specifically what Amy Hubbard from Arcadia will guide you through later today. So what about the sustainability and the feedstock availability of these different SAFs? We will see that biosafs and eSAFs are not equally sustainable, or at least do not have the same sustainability footprints. And looking more detailed at biosafs, it is important to keep in mind that using biomass as a feedstock is not so easy. First, you need to make sure that you can source this biomass as locally as possible. And we know in the EU that domestic production of biomass is limited, and it is not able to cover the complete EU demand. This looks slightly different in the USA, and it's also important to bear in mind where, depending on the market which is being described, and so it's very much of an issue when massive imports of biomass are to be considered. And this points out the absolute, it is very important to make sure that your sourcing is being tracked in a very serious way. Otherwise, there's always the danger that you run into losing actually track of the origin of your biomass. And this applies, of course, to the use of forest residues. And more generally, it is important to bear in mind that waste feedstock utilization could potentially lead to fraud if not sufficiently regulated. So it can all be done and should be done. However, it must be done in a proper way to ensure that your product is sustainable. And looking at this chart, which is taken from Bloomberg NEF, we can also readily see that the available feedstocks of waste fats and used cooking oils is only capable to cover a small fraction of the actual kerosene or jet fuel demand expected, and that this ceiling will probably be reached even before 2030. So here again, it appears obvious that not only BioSAF is the solution, but we also need to look at other types, and eSAF is one of these big candidates. So what about the eSAF sustainability? Virtually, or theoretically at least, feedstocks for eSAF production are unlimited. However, this is of course not completely true. Availability of biogenic CO2 is limited, as it's also derived of biomass. However, we do not stay alone with this option here, and direct air capture will have to be considered increasingly in the coming years. However, we should say that up to today, direct capture is coming with a very high energy intensity and cost intensity as well. And this needs to be drastically improved if we want direct air capture to become a large-scale solution. You remember that we don't need only CO2 for our eSAF, but also large amounts of renewable electricity. So to give you a kind of example here, it would take about half of Europe's today's electricity production to cover Europe's jet fuel demand. Of course, this is an unfair comparison because we never plan to cover the whole jet fuel demand by eSAF. However, this gives you a sort of perspective. So it is obvious that eSAF producers will face strong competition for the access to RED II and RED III compliant electricity sources, or they could also source hydrogen sources directly, as obviously eSAFs or some type of eSAFs, such as the Fischer-Tropsch type, can be considered hydrogen derivatives, right? So how is the jet aviation sector actually classifying in terms of how is it right to use hydrogen for this sector? What we like to use here, and the tool which you see on the screen now, is the Liebreich hydrogen ladder. And this gives you sort of direction, or it is trying to sort different industry sectors by their decarbonization options or greenhouse gas reduction options. And the further you go up on this ladder towards A and B, the less options you have besides hydrogen, and the more legitimate, let's say it this way, is the use of hydrogen. The further you go down here towards F and G, and you could look here, for instance, at cars, the more obvious it is that other options are readily accessible, such as here for all the yellow marked items, the electrification. And taking again the example of the car, we already have battery electric cars driving around. The infrastructure is not quite there, but it's growing very fast. And we already know that these cars come with a better fuel efficiency when they drive on batteries, and they will also have the better cost competitiveness. This is obvious. So where do we stand with jet aviation? As you can see, we are very up high on this ladder. We are on scale number B. And this, just to give you in a nutshell, the idea, it is very obvious that jet aviation has within this global competition around hydrogen a very good position to use hydrogen, right? And this leads me to close my presentation and finish on two statements here. The first is that biosafs and eSAFs are equally needed to reduce aviation's emission. And the second one is that eSAF have a better scalability potential and sustainability potential on the long run. Now, this all depends how the market will be shaped, how the regulatory authorities will pave the way, and this is what is going to be discussed with you, presented to you in the next Vortrag. Thank you very much. Handing over to Thomas.
Yeah, thank you so much, Antoine. It's really interesting to see how the market is here changing, how the market is behaving. Who is the market? It's all of us. It's clear. It's a society's responsibility in which direction we go. But just little area of where we are. I would love to introduce now Watson Farley again from the regulatory perspective, and from that point of view, I would love to hand over to Max, who is our expert, is the expert of Watson Farley related to regulatory aspects.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you are joining us today. I have now the pleasure of spending with you the next 20 minutes or so on the regulatory framework for sustainable aviation fuels. Now, I will focus on the European regulations and drop in here and there maybe a hint or two on local regulations. I know that many of you will have questions on specific types of the regulation or specific regulatory questions. I will try to touch upon the most important points, but having 20 minutes and covering a whole regulatory framework is set to be limited to a certain extent. So therefore, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tool, and we will love to answer them either during the Q&A or later on bilateral. Starting, where does the regulation come from? Where is the key for the EU regulation for sustainable aviation fuels? Well, it's the EU Fit for 55, very famous initiative. And it helps to get the perspective of what we are talking about if we bear in mind what the EU Fit for 55 program initiative is doing. And to also keep that in mind, I know that my dear colleague Christian Bauer came up when the EU 55 was new, and he printed out all documents which were related at that time under the EU 55. So only formal explanations and the EU Fit for 55 themselves. And after approximately 20,000 pages, he gave it up. He was nearly halfway there. So it's one of the most massive EU initiatives to structure the framework for less carbon intensive economy. So the EU Fit for 55 is a general initiative to reduce the EU's net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 level. And it contains several legislative proposals, initiatives, and so on. The main goal which the EU Fit for 55 sets in terms of decarbonization, there are two main topics which you could say. The one is electrify the parts of industry which can be electrified to introduce renewable energy into this electrification and therefore reduce carbon fuels which arise out of the use of non-renewable energies for power production. The other goal is to set up initiatives, regulatory frameworks where electrification cannot be used, and transport, shipping, and aviation, so airlines, come into mind quickly when we're talking about sectors of the economy which can't be decarbonized by using electricity. So what has now happened and what we will discuss today is the Refuel EU Aviation Regulation, which was adopted on 18 October 2023 and entered into force on 1 January 2024. So the Refuel EU Aviation is an EU regulation. What does it mean? And that answers a question we get asked quite often. So what about transposing these regulations and national laws. What does the member states in the EU need to do to make this legally binding? And the answer is nothing. It is already legally binding. And EU regulation is more or less an EU law which is binding for all member states. So everything which is in there is binding law and needs to be obliged by each EU member state. Let's take a closer look at the Refuel EU Aviation. And it makes sense to take into account the general objectives. What is the reason behind the Refuel EU Aviation, which we see? As I said, the legislation is designed to steer the aviation industry towards the environmental goals set by the EU Fit for 55 initiatives. So therefore, a reduction of carbon emissions in the short and medium term. And as I said, this is not done by electrification, but by the introduction of a framework for using sustainable aviation fuel in the airline aircraft aviation economy. It also aims, sustainable aviation fuels are by no means new, and there have been initiatives in member states, for example, Germany, to introduce already certain requirements to use SAF. However, these have been on a larger scale unsuccessful due to two reasons. It was economically not useful to use SAF, and the supply and the availability of SAF was also very limited. So therefore, they were there, they were known, but nobody used them. So what does the Refuel EU Aviation do? It introduces industry-wide obligations aiming at all industry players, all major industry players. So that means fuel suppliers, airports, and airlines, the three. And we will take a look a bit on what is the basic, what's the backbone, what is the framework, what are the obligations introduced now for each one of them. When we look at airlines operating within the EU are caught under the regulatory framework. And that is an important point because these are not European airlines like Lufthansa or other European airlines which are located within the EU. It concerns each airline which departures from major EU airports. And that is pretty much every major aviation or every major airline in the world. And therefore, that means that every every flight departing from major EU airports must include a minimum of SAF blend, regardless of the airline's origin. That's for the airlines. So the airlines are required to take up SAF when they depart from an European airport. What do the airports have to do? Well, the airports are a little bit left off the hook because the airports, the EU says, well, they must provide the necessary infrastructure for SAF storage and blending to support fuel suppliers and airlines in fulfilling their obligations. So it said, airports, you have to set up the infrastructure that SAF can be supplied to airlines. Now, the ones who supply the actual fuel, the fuel suppliers, these are the ones that must ensure that 2% of fuel made available at major EU airports is SAF in 2025, and this is rising to 6% in 2030 and then gradually up to 70% in 2050. So what does it mean? That means that fuel suppliers are required to offer SAF at airports, as we have heard, as drop-in fuel, and airlines are required to take it off. That means we have a whole regulatory framework which deals with the economy of providing fuel and taking off fuel. And the airports, as I said, have to supply the infrastructure for that. Therefore, we have covered the whole economic system. Now, let's take a closer look at the targets, because that is one of the main points and obviously the main provision in the Refuel EU Aviation. As I said, there is a minimum share of SAF required, which is with an additional minimum share of synthetic fuels, which also becomes mandatory from 2030 onwards. The reason for that is what we've just heard, based in the technical explanations, that one has the EU has said it's slightly better to use e-fuels, which are synthetic fuels, rather than biofuels. So in the long run, we will rather rely on e-fuels than we will rely on biofuels, whereby both are needed and both are required. However, to further ramp up the production of e-fuels, there is this minimum share requirement of synthetic fuels, which becomes mandatory in addition to the minimum share of SAF targets. One point here is that there will be a transitional period, because that minimum requirement is based on an airport-to-airport view. That means this minimum requirements have to be fulfilled at every given airport in the EU. This can become problematic because fuels may not be available. In particular, they may not be available in the beginning, or can only be made available at high cost for the environment. So therefore, during the first 5 years, there will be a transitional period applying where a fuel supplier can fulfill these SAF targets by generally fulfilling them in the EU. And it has been, this is one of the most heated debates in my experience, whether this can be done on an ongoing basis. So whether we can say, well, let's see where we can supply SAFs with low costs for the environment, low costs for the economy, and then have a major view over all European airports and see whether in general the target is fulfilled, rather than looking at each airport individually. We will see the EU has just said in the EU Refuel EU Aviation in Article 15 that they will look at it and then check whether this makes sense to introduce such overall looking framework. One other point which has been introduced is a so-called certification scheme, and the certification scheme plays a role in two areas. Firstly, it's regarded which biofuels are acceptable, and there is a major link between the Refuel EU Aviation and the Renewable Energy Directive 3, because the Refuel EU Aviation links into the RED 3, which is a technique which we see quite often nowadays when the EU introduces new environmental regulatory framework, that the Renewable Energy Directive is kind of a major backbone for then other laws to rely back on the Renewable Energy Directive. And then there is a specific certification scheme introduced that airlines can use. It's not mandatory, but which allow them to show that they are doing, that they're fulfilling their obligations, and which should help to say to customers, to airline users, well, look, this is an environmentally better flight compared to others who might not fulfill the SAF requirements. Let's discuss which type of SAF are eligible. I've listed them here, and the first topic I would like to touch upon is the certified biofuels. Because certified biofuels are, we have just heard, biofuels produced from agricultural, forestry residue, algae, or bio-waste. However, this is limited. What is not included, and that's a major point, is food crops. We will not produce sustainable aviation fuels or other fuels on the long run from food crops. And the reason for that is that the EU has introduced also in other legislations more of a reluctant approach to using food crops for the production of fuel. Therefore, they're excluded from the type of eligible SAF. The other topic which I would like to mention is the renewable fuels of non-biological origin, which we've just heard, which are the e-fuels. This is probably the fuels which we, as we said, will use in the future. However, for the start, the most important biofuels will probably come from organic waste or fatty acids. That's what we already heard. There are two others which could also be used: recycled carbon aviation fuels and low carbon aviation fuels. However, the most important ones will be the e-fuels once they become really available on a large scale, and the other one will be the certified biofuels. As I said, the fuels must comply with the RED III sustainability and emission saving criteria. And what we've seen in practice when we looked at certain projects, and Tom will remember this when we looked at the KGAL project, is that this requires really the interaction of technical and regulatory experts to check whether these sustainable and emission saving criteria are really fulfilled for any given project. The same applies, it's not listed here, but the same applies for the origin of the CO2 which you require. It's one major topic in the refuel aviation is that the legislator wants to have a certain balance between different types of fuels. So there's not one which covers all. And we have just heard from Antoine why that is, because we will need each and every one of this. Otherwise, we will probably get in supply issues. Let's look for a moment on the airlines and the so-called anti-tankering provisions. What is tankering? Tankering means I load up more fuel than I need to reach my destination. And I do that because the fuel where I loaded it, where I take it, is just cheaper, so I can use, I'm not required to take fuel at a destination where it might be more expensive. The issue with that is the extra weight comes with extra emissions, and the EU wants to avoid that. So the anti-tankering provisions require every airline to take at least 90% of their annual fuel needs at the EU airports. Again, that creates an issue that means that the fuel which is required needs to be there to be taken off. So, however, this is quite a strict regulation. So let's see how this develops in practice. Now, finally, I want to spend a few moments on the enforcement. The enforcement will be steered by member states' authorities. And why is that? It is the EU has no authority to deal with any fine and any punishments. It's just not have the legislative power to do that. That power resides with the member states. So each member state is required to propose penalties for fuel suppliers and airlines if they violate the obligations they have. Now, what the EU does and what they have introduced here is a certain set of financial penalties for fuel suppliers, a minimum penalty, if you will. So if the member state, for example, an airline violates its takeoff obligations, with regard to fuel, it will be required to pay a fine which is at least the double amount of the difference between the annual market price for jet fuel and the price for the SAF. So that in any event, it's cheaper to buy SAF than to pay the fine. And the same also applies to the fuel suppliers if they don't provide the fuel and in the required amount. Now, where's the issue with that? The issue with that is, how do you determine a market price? And that leaves room for lots of discussions, and which is in practice a huge issue, because there is no general description or general definition of market price. So the EU has said, well, we will give you some guidance papers, which should be due in July. Let's see whether they are coming, to explain a bit more how this should be calculated. However, this is, in my view, a bit problematic because it still leaves lots of rooms for discussion, for legal claims, and at the end of the day, it's probably the European Court of Justice who will tell us how a market price will be calculated. The issue with that is we are talking quite significant sums here, and with these significant sums there comes a significant risk. So if I could make a wish to the legislators, is please provide us with a little more guidance in regard to how are market prices and fines to be calculated, because this is an obligation without a fine doesn't make any sense. So this is where the whole obligation really becomes an obligation which is to be observed, because it's economically useful to do that. However, if you can't really calculate how much economically it hurts, you take away lots of the sharpness, if you will, of the regulation in itself. That was my tour d'horizon for the EU Refuel EU Aviation. I thank you very much, and I hand over to Dirk.
You stay.
And stay.
You stay. Thank you very much, Max, for this very interesting overview of the regulatory framework. We have received some questions from our participants. Sorry, but I need my glasses for this. So this one is, who are the fuel suppliers obligated to supply SAF to EU airports? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
I can. There is a definition in the Refuel EU which is an EU airport, which is an EU fuel supplier, so it's basically defined. Who are these fuel suppliers? Well, the fuel suppliers are the ones who are wishing to sell fuel at any given airport in the EU which is covered. So it's basically the same companies which provide jet fuel today already. And this is also how the regulation is structured. It aims at, and just to provide some names, a BP or a Shell or the major companies and also the smaller companies which provide fuel on the market, which sell kerosene, that are governed by this regulation.
Okay, thank you. Another one relates to also regulatory issues. Which is the overall governing mandate for SAF usage? Refuel EU Aviation or RED III's mandate on use of biofuels, e-fuels in transportation?
It will be the Refuel EU for aviation, because it's the more specific regulation, and as a general topic, it's that the specific regulation overrules the general regulation. However, it has been pointed out by several commentators that that the EU has a bit lost its sight of where it has set the goals, and that this needs to be aligned. Well, it can be that we will see a certain alignment to match the RED III with the Refuel EU Aviation. However, for now, the Refuel EU Aviation as the more defined and more specified regulation will, in my view, overrule anything that's written in the RED III.
Okay, thank you very much. There's one question, I don't know whether you can answer that, because it goes more into technique. Why do you think that eSAF is the future? Think about fast-growing saltwater algae or seaweeds as feedstock for biogas.
That is indeed a question which is more for technicians to advise. The point is with all the biogas all the biofeedstock we have available right now, and which we have seen in the use of biofeedstock for electricity production, it has always become a problem in the long run when you talk about major supply. It all works on a small scale, but if you then really take it to industrial scale, if you really ramp it up, the first thing which becomes really an issue is the availability of feedstock. And I've seen this now happening for close to 20 years, and with the first biomass plants being introduced, and then the feedstock became an issue, and was always the feedstock which was not available, or not available in the quality which was required, or there were other issues with that. For example, take palm oil, which was used for energy production in Germany for quite a while. So therefore, just talking from past experience, I would be a bit reluctant to believe that we now find the feedstock which will allow for bioproduction, but I may be proven wrong here. It's only me, myself, and I talking from past experience.
Good. Do we have time for another question? Because there's one question various participants asked. Can the minimum quota be changed by the EU in the future? Is this likely to happen?
Can it be changed? Yes, every law can be changed. Will it be changed? I don't believe that. You see the Refuel EU Aviation and also the Refuel EU Maritime are EU regulations which have undergone probably 4 or 5 years of legislative procedure. So what we see here now is the results of negotiations between member states, between stakeholders, and every involved party. So this is what came out of this. And I don't think that this will be changed overnight or in a nutshell. It might be changed in the future if we see, well, maybe they were a bit too high, maybe they were a bit too low. There might be a mandate, but I don't think that we will see something completely different, and certainly not in the foreseeable future.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Max. I think now you are released.
Thank you.
Thanks for your really fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Then we move on, and so far we have received an overview of the technical basics of SAF from Antoine. Now we have heard about the regulatory framework, and now it's time, I think, to dive into the analysis of the SAF market in Europe, which Maximilian Held will do for us. Max is aviation lead at Systemic, a certified B Corporation and sustainability advisory. Systemic also leads the secretariat of Project SkyPower, a CEO-led initiative to make eSAF a commercial reality by the end of this decade. Max holds a PhD in CO2 reduction strategies for the European transport sector from ETH Zurich and has over 7 years experience in renewable fuels. Max, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dirk. It's a pleasure having the opportunity today to talk about the current state of the SAF market in Europe. So for the next 15 minutes, I want to answer 4 key questions. If we go to the next slide. And directly the first one. So number 1 is, what is the current global SAF pipeline, or is the current global SAF pipeline sufficient to lead us to net zero by 2050? Second, what does the European eSAF pipeline currently look like? So here we are focusing on one of the most promising SAF types in the future, eSAF, that we've already heard about. Number 3, how do current regulations support the ramp up of SAF, complementing what we've already heard? And then number 4, what are the main barriers that prevent SAF projects from getting to FID? I'll also touch upon the question whether Refuel EU targets could be changed in the future, because I think it's a quite interesting one when we are looking at eSAF in particular. So we'll come to that in a second, but let's get started with the first question. Next slide, please. Decarbonizing aviation is obviously one of the greatest challenges in the fight against climate change. And SAF is obviously one of the main solutions to do that. But what we have to do is we have to build an entirely new industry, more or less from scratch, in less than 30 years. So that's the challenge ahead of us. Last year, the global SAF supply stood at about 500,000 tons. That's about 0.2% of global SAF demand. So almost nothing. The current SAF pipeline could theoretically bring us up to 32 million tons by 2030. So that's the column in the middle, which could exactly be the market tipping point after which exponential scaling kicks in that could bring us to the required volumes by 2050 that you see on the right-hand side. Obviously, that's a big challenge. But what is even a bigger challenge, I would say, is that we need to scale novel types of SAF in addition. And we've already heard Antoine laying out the differences between the different SAF types, in foremost biosaf versus eSAF. So high integrity biosaf is definitely needed, but will not be able to decarbonize aviation alone due to the globally limited availability of sustainable biomass feedstock and also competing demands from other sectors, because everybody wants to access sustainable biomass in the future. So it will need to be complemented by large volumes of eSAF. That's what you can see on the right-hand side. However, the current SAF pipeline, jumping back to what we are currently seeing in the making, is dominated by HEFA. That's the type of biosaf that is already on the market. So we have this discrepancy that the pipeline currently is dominated by HEFA, but in the future, we will need large shares of eSAF as well. So let's focus on eSAF for a bit as one of those novel SAF types that we need to scale in the next decades. Next slide, please. Here you can see the globally announced eSAF capacity by 2030 that could come online by 2030 if all of those eSAF projects would make it. Obviously, that's unrealistic. Not all of those projects will get to FID or will be built and will start off production. But that's kind of the upper level, the upper limit that we could get to. Filtering smaller scale pilot and demo plans in the second column, and then focusing on the projects that only have an annual eSAF output of at least 25,000 tons, we see that about 2/3 of first-of-a-kind large-scale eSAF projects are currently being planned in Europe. So Europe is really home to a lot of innovation and a willingness to bring eSAF to market, not least due to the Refuel EU mandate that we have already seen. So next slide, we mapped out where those projects are, who is involved, how large those projects are, and when start of production is being planned. Now, this is a living document, as there are regularly new announcements being made, and I already realized today that one in France is missing, but you'll find an interactive map that is regularly updated on our website, project-skypower.org. You see a strong focus here on the Nordics, Germany, and France, with surprisingly few projects announced on the Iberian Peninsula and Eastern Europe. Why do we see that geographical representation? The two ingredients for eSAF projects to be successful are the availability of constant low-cost power, and second, the availability of biogenic CO2 as the main carbon source the industry is currently looking at since the publication of the delegated acts by the EU Commission, which sets out how eSAF can and cannot be produced in the future. Beyond those delegated acts, the EU Commission has also put a quite comprehensive regulatory framework in place, which we have already heard about, at least to a certain extent, and we will see on the next slide as well. However, despite demand and supply side policies, those first-of-a-kind eSAF projects struggle currently to reach final investment decision. So what we see here is on the left-hand side, the SAF mandate starting next year. We've already heard about that, including the eSAF sub-mandate in blue. And then on the right-hand side, you see some financial support mechanisms, both provided at the European Commission, but also at the member states or national level, such as the SAF allowances, the EU Innovation Fund, the European Hydrogen Bank, the EU Catalyst Program, etc., etc. I only want to highlight one of those, the SAF allowances. SAF allowances work as follows. An airline buys and uses a certain amount of SAF this year, for example. The next year, the airline can apply for SAF allowances, which could cover up to 100% of the green premium. So 100% of the cost differential between eSAF and fossil jet fuel could be covered through those SAF allowances. Sounds great, doesn't it? And I would say it is indeed. However, there are a few obstacles that need to be resolved. And I want to touch upon those and talk through how the SAF allowances could also be changed to be more impactful. So number one, the current year-by-year and ex post first come first serve allocation does not provide revenue certainty and therefore does not support bankability for the eSAF producer, because you would only get those SAF allowances every year, one after the other, and it's not guaranteed that you will get those. So you lack revenue certainty, and therefore it's hard to get to bankability. Second, the current funding volume, 20 million allowances, are worth roughly 1.6 billion euros. Even if provided for a period of 10 years, instead of year by year, as I've mentioned, this would only be sufficient to support about one eSAF project. So restructuring the SAF allowances could ensure indeed a better support of the eSAF market ramp up through three main things. Number one, making the allowances available for multiple years to match long-term offtake agreements that we need. Number two, increasing the overall funding volume to support the first wave of eSAF projects. And number three, considering also a dedicated eSAF funding pot, because those SAF allowances are available for BioSAF as well. And there's a good chance that all the SAF allowances might just flow into BioSAF alone, whereas we need to scale eSAF as well. So now let's focus back on the left-hand side. Critically, the eSAF sub-mandate in blue starts in 2030 with a share of 1.2%. Let's try to answer whether we are on track to actually achieve that. And now I'm coming back to the question raised earlier, whether RefuelEU could actually be changed. If we go to the next slide, please. What we see here is that the majority of the planned eSAF production capacity in Europe is not on track to reach FID. And you see that we took an approach here where we looked at the map that I showed earlier and then classified which projects are actually on track to FID by 2025, end of next year, because only then those projects will have a good chance to be operational by 2030 and contribute to the RefuelEU sub-mandate. And then second column, you see that those projects really required significant support to reach FID by 2025. And then the others rather being off track according to where they currently stand. Are they in pre-feasibility, feasibility, FEED, etc. So there's currently a high likelihood that we will actually not have the volumes up and running for the eSAF sub-mandate by 2030. If we don't intervene now, and we are really at this make or break point right now, we need to see the first FIDs in large-scale eSAF projects in the next 1.5 years. And therefore, coming back to this question, whether RefuelEU could be changed, well, in 2027, the EU Commission is planning to review RefuelEU. And if they see by then that actually the eSAF mandate by 2030 is infeasible because there are no projects being built or no FIDs being reached yet, then I think the conclusion could be that you cannot mandate something that is technically infeasible. So it's really a strategic importance to make sure that those first large-scale eSAF projects get to FID by end of next year. Moving on to the next slide. Now, why are those eSAF projects not getting to FID? And this holds true probably for many other novel SAF types as well. And we've made a long list of barriers and shortlisted those and come up with a very succinct answer, which is 4 main barriers. Number 1, feedstock risk. 2, technology risk. 3, price risk with the off-taker. And 4, financing risk. And we're currently developing a set of solutions. This is just the highest level views in the green boxes that you can see here. What needs to be done in order to overcome those barriers? So what are the potential solutions? And probably we need a combination of those solutions because we need to address all of those 4 risks. Feedstock risk could be addressed through streamlining permitting of renewable electricity assets and reducing grid fees. These are just examples. There are obviously many other ways as well. Technology risk could be covered through technology guarantees and also private insurances. The price risk, which is the first mover disadvantage. If you enter a long-term offtake agreement right now as an offtaker, but the cost of eSAF is supposed to come down quite a bit in the future, you're actually at the risk that you're locking in a too high cost that you will see over the coming years. So here the question is, how can we unlock premium private sector offtake? How can we make this happen and also combine it with public support? Because it's quite clear that it will require public support, such as the SAF allowances or the EU Hydrogen Bank, etc., to make this happen. And lastly, the financing risk. This is could, for example, be covered by concessional loans by the European Investment Bank, loan guarantees by export credit agencies, or setting up a diversified SAF plant to diversify the risk of investing into SAF projects and eSAF projects in particular. Moving on to the next slide. So in summary, eSAF can improve the energy trilemma, but needs to reach commercial scale by 2030, as I've already elaborated, because only then we can unlock its strong cost down potential, which comes from renewable electricity costs, CO2 capture costs, electrolyzer costs, which are all expected to come down. We can discuss how much, but they're expected to come down, and achieve the required production volumes for net zero by 2050. So here you can see the classical energy trilemma that could be improved through eSAF. Energy sustainability, obviously, it's a huge opportunity. eSAF could contribute to 0.5 gigaton of CO2 equivalent by 2050 of CO2 equivalent abatement. This compares to 50 gigatons that we are emitting. So it's about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Then next, energy affordability. eSAF could potentially become the most affordable SAF type. And here we are trying to help the ecosystem by providing clarity about what the eSAF production costs currently look like, because it's such a complex topic. And lastly, energy security. Obviously, if you have some production levels within Europe, that increases energy security and supply security. I'm not saying that eSAF should be produced only in Europe, because it doesn't make a lot of sense, because there are many other regions in the world that have better renewable electricity availability and also cheaper costs. So therefore, other regions might be the big producers in the long run, but at least a certain share of production in Europe might make sense. I've been saying a couple of times that we are working on stuff like these. The next slide will show how we are doing that. And it is through Project Skypower, a CEO-led cross-value chain initiative to make eSAF a commercial reality by 2030. So what do? We try to pave the way for the first large-scale plants in Europe to reach FID by end of next year, looking at those that have already been announced. Who is doing that? We are led by 12 CEOs from across the European energy and aviation value chain. It currently says 10 plus additional companies in working groups, and it's an open initiative, so other companies can join. We're currently already at about 30 companies that have joined, Watson Farley being one of them. The Secretariat is powered by Systemic, Mission Possible Partnership, and the Green Finance Institute, and we are supported by 3 philanthropies: Breakthrough Energy, Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and Climate Works Foundation. How do we want to do that? That's on the bottom left-hand side, through a series of working group meetings where we bring together the whole value chain and we provide the analytical backbone to create transparency around the value chain economics, as I've said, to raise the confidence of investors to finance eSAF projects, and then to unifying the voices of the eSAF ecosystem behind a set of solutions, as I've already described on the previous page. And then lastly, when is that happening? We've launched this in May this year, and it's running until end of next year, because that's our mission, to bring the first large-scale eSAF projects to FID until end of next year. And with that, I conclude. On the next slide, you see my details, slides are already gone, but happy to answer any questions, and feel free to reach out through those 2 email addresses if you want to learn more. Thanks so much.
Yeah, Max, so thank you so much for that you are giving us this great impression about Project Sky Power. We as KGAL, we are part of the team, so to say. We look into the market from the different angles. And for sure, we have also some questions sometimes. And one question, what also we see from the audience, what we would love to share with you is, what do you think? Is there so much public funding available? So why is the eSAF stuff not scaling? Is it a technical area? What is the area of concern? In particular, are SAF allowances fit for purpose to bring eSAF projects to FID? Where is the bottleneck? What do you think? What is the next step?
It's a really good question. And what we've started to do is actually laying out what public funding is available at European level and at national member states level within the EU, but also at the UK level, for example. And we see that actually quite a lot of funding is available. The problem is that sometimes it's hard to access, and sometimes the public funding mechanisms are not only for eSAF, but they are also for other hydrogen derivatives, for example, or other renewable energy carriers. As, for example, the SAF allowances, we have already said that this is not only for eSAF, it's also for BioSAF. So eSAF competes directly with potentially cheaper forms of SAF right now, even though the long-term picture might be a different one. And then if we look at the European Hydrogen Bank, for example, which supports hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives, here we have seen that, for example, the first auction of the European Hydrogen Bank foremost rewarded the low-hanging fruits, so direct use of hydrogen or ammonia, for example, because the overall green premium is just way lower for those use cases. For eSAF, it's very high at the beginning. Still, we need to see the investments right now to unlock the cost reduction curve. And therefore, I think one thing that is quite important is to understand what financing mechanisms, also from a public sector side, are the most important and most impactful ones. And then is there a chance that some of those funding mechanisms can provide a dedicated eSAF funding support mechanism, like, for example, a dedicated eSAF auction from the European Hydrogen Bank, or restructuring the SAF allowances, or there are many options, and we're currently exploring those.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Max, for giving us this very good and decent answer on that part. From a KGAL perspective, from a financial investor's perspective, we have not only to look for the project and the technical risk and so on. Another area of burden comes to us, another area of restriction, another area of attitudes in which projects are good for us. And we use the word sustainability very often. And as you know, do you have a certain kind of an value footprint? How much water is used for producing eSAF compared to biogenic SAF? How much land is necessary to produce a biogenic fuel compared to an eSAF fuel? And for sure, what is the best instrument then for Europe? Because land is definitely not available for only eSAF or for biogenic SAF production. What do you think about these elements of sustainability production?
It's a really good question, and I could actually dig out some numbers. I don't know them by heart, but if you compare BioSAF to eSAF, and it's in general the case for e-fuels versus biofuels, if biofuels are relying on dedicated crops, for example, usually the water footprint, the land footprint is way higher, like an order of magnitude higher compared to eSAF. And that's purely because you just have a very energy density in solar PV, for example, or wind power plants compared to photosynthesis. In the end, however, we will need both solutions. We will need BioSAF and we will need eSAF. So the question is really, how can we scale both at the same time and avoid that we are running full throttle at BioSAF and then realize later on that biosaf will not be sufficient on its own, and then only start moving to eSAF, because then, because of market dynamics, it will be too late. I've already shared that those plants need about 5 years to be built between FID and start of production. And before FID, they need a couple of years to actually being planned and go through all the planning stages. So market dynamics really kick in here. And I'm happy to provide a couple of more numbers on water and land availability, because land footprint, because we looked at that as well.
Thank you so much, Max. As you can see from the audience, we have also received a couple of questions which are related to some other parts. So we would rather skip the most questions then later on to the panel discussion. So from now on, I would say thank you so much, Max, for that you are with us, joining us in this webinar. We will start now with a break. At 4:40 p.m. today, we will have and start again here on broadcasting, and we will have Amy Herbert, one of the CEOs or the CEO of Arcadia eFuels, with us, because she is showing us as an entrepreneur exactly one specific project where also we from KGAL side with our funds are very strong aligned with and invested. And then you see what is her view, and she is also coming from Houston, Texas. So it's really a pleasure that we in our webinar are not only coming from pure Europe, so also Houston, Texas will at 4:40 be with us. So we're looking forward to hear you and see you all back at 4:40 sharp. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning to the US. It's a pleasure now to introduce to all of you our Amy Herbert, the CEO of Arcadia eFuels. Amy Herbert is the CEO and founder of Arcadia eFuels, a company with the mission to combat climate change by producing sustainable fuels with a net zero carbon footprint. In a project full of firsts, Amy and the Arcadia team have worked to create a first-of-its-kind commercial e-fuels that is becoming a reality, with their first location set to be built with us in Europe, in Vordingborg, Denmark. Amy has a long track record in the refining and process engineering sector and has put together an impressive team of industry professionals with experience building and operating complex fuel and chemical production facilities. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology. Amy is also Supervisory Board Member, Nomination Audit Committee Member of IMCD. And don't forget, Amy, you are my partner in the project Vordingborg, and we count on you that this project becomes financially close and one of the first ones in Europe. The show is yours. Applause to you and many greetings.
Thank you, Thomas. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So I have been asked to talk about producing SAF and the challenges around that. And we've heard some of that this morning already, or this afternoon in Europe. So let's just jump right in. I think what's really important here is that time is of the essence. We can go to the next slide. Carbon emissions are a global issue. We see every day something else happening around the world of the impact of carbon emissions, between people dying, houses being washed away, food prices going up. So it's something that we have to tackle. We cannot afford to wait. And Arcadia eFuels feels this sense of urgency and is doing everything we can to accelerate getting eSAF to the market as soon as possible. eSAF is a great way to decarbonize aviation. It's a product that's a drop-in replacement. It has a net zero carbon footprint, carbon emission footprint. So it's really key to have more and more of these projects come to market as soon as possible. Okay, the next slide. So the market demand is here. We have seen that the EU and also the UK have implemented mandates for SAF and also eSAF. So it's great to see this, mandatory compliance of using these types of products in aviation. And I think it's also exciting that we're seeing companies working to reduce their Scope 3 emissions by, signing contracts for SAF and eSAF as well. So we have both a voluntary and an involuntary market that we are aiming to help support. Arcadia eFuels does have one of the largest scale and the most advanced eSAF plants, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But I think that the world is really relying on all of us in this industry to become more educated about what the carbon emissions mean for the society and how to reduce them. And there's many, many solutions to achieve this. I think Antoine spoke this morning about hydrogen aircraft, and so there's lots of different ways to get here. But the world needs all of us, and it's important that we continue to work together to advance all these technologies in the space. But building a cleaner future starts now. And I think this seminar is another way to help us understand this. So when we think about SAF, what is SAF and what are e-fuels? So today, most of the fuel comes from either crude oil or natural gas-based fuels. So this is what we're phasing out. And when we look at the sustainable aviation fuel market, we have biofuels, and there's been some good headway now on alcohol to jet, which is great to see. And then we have these renewable fuels, which are mainly producing diesel, but now we see more and more refineries switching to make kerosene or eSAF, or SAF, and they're typically using waste cooking oils, vegetable oils that they can convert into kerosene and SAF. So that's also a fantastic way to do it. There's also companies working to do waste to fuels via gasification. So that's fantastic. Any type of feedstock we have that's not being used in another way, just going to waste, turning it into fuels is fantastic. So great to see that. But as we've also heard today, that those feedstocks are limited. So we need another solution, and e-fuels is that other solution. E-fuels is not feedstock constraint. These are products produced from renewable electricity and using water as a feedstock. It can also be salt water, so it doesn't have to be fresh water, and using captured carbon. So obviously there's too much CO2 in the air. That's what we're solving for. So again, that should not be a limitation on feedstocks. So on the next slide, we can learn a little bit more about what an e-fuels process looks like. So basically taking sun, water, or hydropower, we can convert that into renewable electricity, take renewable electricity in combination with water through electrolysis to produce hydrogen. And then we take the hydrogen, combine that with CO2, preferably biogenic CO2, hopefully in the longer term, direct air capture CO2, combine that in a syngas reactor. We're actually using an electrified reverse water gas shift reactor. Again, basically proven technology. It runs today. The only new thing that we're doing here is we're using electrically heated inputs to this reactor so that we don't need to have any fossil inputs whatsoever to the entire process. Then you take the syngas and you do a Fischer-Tropsch and product refining. And this process from syngas, Fischer-Tropsch, and refining is used today around the world. Shell and Sasol have technology with many, many plants running around the world. So what we're doing is we're scaling down the gas to liquids approach and scaling up electrolysis and the use of renewable electricity to have the optimum scale that we think is going to be important for the next, say, 10 years. And this process produces mainly SAF. Some portion of the product is naphtha. And then we have the ability to produce diesel. That's not something we're focusing on now, but as we look to decarbonize other areas of long-haul transportation, diesel can be an excellent choice for that. So on the next slide, we want to talk a little bit about Arcadia eFuels and what we're all about. So we are a pure play eFuels developer and operator. This is all what we're focused on doing. We have developed 3 projects. So one is in Denmark, our most advanced project, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We also have a project in the UK where we won a grant from the UK government to help cover the development cost. And we're also working on a project in the US in Texas. We do have other projects that we're looking at, but those are not publicly announced. But there's a lot of potential in other countries where we can see a good fit to make e-fuels. I think one thing that sets us apart is we have a very highly capable team. all around the world. So we're truly a global team, and several of our team members have extensive experience with gas to liquids projects, both at Shell and Sasol. So that's been very helpful as we look at our design and how we're going to bring this to market. We have created a standardized plant design. It produces about 80,000 tons per year of e-fuels, and around 70,000 tons of that is eSAF. And like I mentioned, we're using proven technology everywhere we can, but we're bringing the pieces together that haven't been done in this way before. So it's a novel integration, but mainly leveraging proven technology. So when we look at our project in Denmark, we're calling it Project Indoor. It's in Vordingborg, Denmark. It's about 1 hour south of Copenhagen. As I mentioned before, this is a fully electrified plant. You can see the 3D rendering on the side, but this is what we'll be building. This site will reduce CO2 emissions by 260,000 tons per year, and it will further offset another 260,000 tons per year of emissions with the fact that we're making green hydrogen and not using any fossil hydrogen in the process. So it's a very significant CO2 emission reduction potential with the products. The raw materials are very simple: renewable electricity, biogenic CO2, and seawater. And we are building about a 280 megawatt electrolyzer, and we need about 360 megawatts for the entire plant. As I mentioned, we're not using any fossil inputs for the plant whatsoever. Everything will come from renewable electricity. So it's a very sustainable plant that, coupled with using seawater, is just a great footprint and can show the world that we can make fuels and not have to compete with any kind of freshwater sources or using any fossil fuels. So where we are on the project, you can go to the next slide. So the status here is that we've completed the FEED, which is the front-end engineering design. We've done this with Technip Energies and Hitachi. Hitachi is working on our high voltage cable and substation, and Technip will be doing the balance of plant. Right now, because we have completed this FEED, the front-end engineering design, we are now working towards our final investment decision, which will be followed by financial close. BNP Paribas is our financial advisor. We've been working with them for almost a year now, trying to get all of these pieces in place, and we're really happy that we're at the stage now of just finalizing all of our project documents and starting the equity raise now. We've done some market soundings on the debt side and looking fine there, but bringing everything together and getting the debt and equity in place is the next step. We would very much love to have some government support, and we can talk a little bit about that in a minute, what that could mean and how we need more and more government support to make e-fuels a reality. But this, once we have reached our financial close, we still have a 3-year construction. So looking for a product to be on the market in 2028, that would coincide with the UK mandates on eSAF, and it would be just a couple years ahead of the mandates in Europe on eSAF. So this we've been working on this probably for about 3 years already. So it's almost a 7-year start to finish project. So it's quite extensive. So we need more and more of these projects to be at this stage and get to FID in order to make sure that the mandates stick. So now digging in a little bit to what I've been asked to talk about around the challenges here to get these projects off the ground. I'm just going to There's many challenges, but we're just going to focus on 4 of them today. So it's around RFNBO compliance, so renewable fuel of non-biological origin, having the fully wrapped lump sum turnkey EPC engineering, procurement, and construction contracts, how we deal with the green premium, and just the general difficulties and challenges around having a project finance project. So we can go to the next slide and look at the challenges around RFNBO compliance. And this is very simple because there are many more regulations. I think we heard this morning around the Refuel EU and RED 2, RED 3. But this is just one element of focusing on the challenges for electricity sourcing when you're making these e-fuels. So basically, if you're doing a direct connect, which is basically impossible for e-fuels at scale because you need to run continuously. So direct connection is very difficult. But if you were to direct connect, then you wouldn't have to meet the temporal correlation or geographical correlation or have PPAs, right? If you're grid connected, then there's a few different ways, 4 different ways actually, that you can deal with the regulations and be compliant. Obviously, the most advantaged one is if the grid is above 90% renewable. That's option 2 here. Then you don't have any requirements around additionality, temporal correlation, etc. But if your grid is not 90% renewable and your emissions from the grid are higher than this 18 grams of CO2 per megajoule equivalent, and you don't have any curtailment, you have to comply with all of these difficult things to put in place, such as additionality, temporal correlation, etc. So these are the kinds of things when people develop e-fuel projects, it's one of the first things they look at is how can we tackle just this one piece of getting the complicated regulations. So I would say longer term, certainly most grids will be over 90% renewable, things will be easy, but in the short term, in the next 10, 15 years, it makes these projects very challenging to get off the ground. So this is something that we need to continually think about and work through. Okay, next slide. So then another challenge is getting a lump sum turnkey price. So I will say, I didn't mention this before, but just to get to the point of being able to complete the FEED for these projects is very expensive. It's very time consuming. I mean, it will typically take 12 to 18 months to complete a FEED and, tens of millions of euros to do this. So getting to this point of completing FEED is already a huge accomplishment. But again, getting a lump sum turnkey product from the EPCs is very, very challenging. So what does this mean? This means that the banks in Europe are not willing to take a risk. And so they need EPC contractors to fully take all of the risk and give a one lump sum price for the project itself, so that there's no risk to the banks. The risk is then transferred to EPC contractors. This is something that EPC companies do not do anymore. Hasn't been done for many, many, many years, but now it's coming back when we see this energy transition happening. So this has been quite challenging. Bottom line is what this means is it adds roughly 20% to the price of the project. So you're already looking at a very capital intensive project, and adding 20% premium on top of this is going to make many eSAF plants just unaffordable. So it's something that we have to tackle as an industry. Okay, next slide. So what I wanted to show you here, this is a little bit busy, but I think it's important that we talk about this. So this is just a generic case. So there's 2 scenarios here. One, if you have a capital cost of 1 billion euros, and one, if you have a capital cost of 2 billion euros. And just remember that if we do a lump sum turnkey, you're adding about 20% here. So in the 1 billion euro case, you're looking at 200 million euros just, as a premium to get that type of contract. And on a 2 billion capital case, you're looking at about a 400 million euro premium. So very significant costs are being added to this by going this route. So one thing is, the capital intensity of these projects are just high. Now, to get a required return on investment, you're looking at somewhere, the minimum is really 10%. Obviously, equity investors and banks would like to see us be more, 20% and above. But, for these first of a kind projects, getting to the market, we need to accept a lower return so that the price of eSAF is affordable for airlines and so forth. So, if you're looking at around a 15% average return on your project, then you start looking at what is the electricity cost. Electricity costs in Europe are high. That's the fact of the matter. In many cases, they're 100 euros a megawatt hour or above. And in that particular case, with high capital cost, you're looking at about 16 times the price of eSAF versus fossil kerosene. That's expensive. On a low end case, if the capital can be around 1 billion and you're able to get 25 euros a megawatt hour for electricity, which doesn't really exist in most places, then you're looking at about 6 times the cost of fossil kerosene. So I show this because I know there's a lot of talk and people saying that eSAF will become fossil fuel parity by 2030. That is just not possible. Now, will it be possible in the long run? I don't know. Time will tell, but certainly we'll be able to pull more and more cost out of these e-fuel plants over time when the grids are more stable, when grids are above 90% renewable, when electrolyzers have matured and have become more energy efficient, when we can scale up to, we're already at a large scale, but if we can do, 4x, 10x the scale we are today, again, there'll be efficiencies there. But I want to reiterate that, when wind and solar were first coming off the ground in the early 2000s, and even 10, 15 years ago, solar energy from solar and wind was very expensive. And through government subsidies and government support, a lot of projects were built. And now we're seeing in many cases that wind and solar are actually cheaper than fossil-based energy. So I believe the same thing will happen in e-fuels. You just can't expect that a brand new product like an eSAF can compete with an 80-year-old fossil fuel industry. That's just not realistic. So that brings us to the challenge of the green premium. So we are looking at, say, 6 to 16 times the cost of fossil fuels. How do we bridge this gap? I believe that the EU government thought that they could solve it just by having mandates, that with the mandates, people would build e-fuel projects, and that would be that. But we're seeing that that's not necessarily enough. So the way the EU works is that the mandates are on the fuel distributors. So fuel distributors will pay a penalty if they do not comply with the mandates. The penalty is going to be the e-fuel market price minus the fossil price times 2. So for example, let's just say that the eSAF price was 10 euros a kilogram and the fossil price is €1 per kilogram. That's 10 minus 1 equals 9, 9 times 2, 18. The penalty is 18 euros a kilogram. That's a significant penalty, okay? But the problem is that is not helpful to sign long-term offtake agreements, and you're still having this green premium. Who's going to pay that? That's the airlines. So the airlines are going to get these costs passed through to them, and then they're going to have to in turn raise their prices for airline travelers. And so there's a lot of people in the value chain, and it's actually quite complicated. But so the mandates are good, and they do have a role to play, but it's not enough. We need to see more incentives to help bridge this green premium gap. And the EU government has also outlined an incentive for airlines called the ETS allowance scheme, which allows airlines to receive up to 95% of this premium back in credits. The problem with this program is it's, again, way down in the value chain to the airlines. The airlines don't know if they get it until after they apply for it, which is only on a 1-year basis. So that doesn't encourage any airlines to sign long-term offtake agreements with e-fuel producers. So again, there's good elements in place, but it's not enough to help us get these e-fuel projects off the ground. We're also seeing the debt costs are very high. And so how can we have, government-backed loans or green bonds or something that can help not increase the cost more of the debt that's needed to build these projects, because they are capital intensive. One way to do this would be have revenue certainty, and this is the approach that the UK government has taken. The UK government has put in a buyout price, which is around, at the highest greenhouse gas emission reduction, it's around 10 euros a kilogram of a buyout price. So that's kind of the first market indication that we have on what the eSAF price should be. So we're really happy to see that, but Europe has not gone this route. So it's going to take some more discussions and iterations to see where we end up landing on how to bridge this green premium gap. One thing I wanted to mention here, this is a little bit off the subject, but I think it's important to realize that, flying you could say is a luxury, but food is not a luxury. You could argue that maybe olive oil and cocoa are maybe a luxury food items, but due to climate change, there's many olive tree farms and cocoa farms that have been destroyed through this climate change. And so the price of these two products has gone up, 5-fold in the last few years. And I think that we're going to see more and more things being affected, more and more crops being affected by climate change, and the prices are going to start to go up. That is not what we want, right? So we have about 10% of the world's population travels on airplanes. We need to make sure that those travelers are paying to help reduce CO2 emissions so that the entire world is not affected by climate change and food prices going up. So it just is a little aside, and I think we all get fixated on this green premium and the price of eSAF, and I think we need to change the discussion here, because we cannot afford not to pay the premium for eSAF or regular SAF. We have got to make sure that we reduce emissions and we reduce them fast. Okay, so another challenge we have here is project finance. And because a lot of these projects are being produced by companies like Aviation Fuels that really don't have an existing businesses, don't have a balance sheet. You have to go the project finance route. To do that, you need, long-term offtake agreements, you need long-term raw material agreements. Everything needs to be completely risk-free contractually and have the risk all outlined very clearly so that the banks and the equity investors aren't taking so many risks into this project. So it is quite a long process to get here. I think we have around 50 or 60 project documents that basically are all interrelated to each other. It takes an enormous amount of work to pull this off, but it's been done before. Many companies do this, so it's not impossible, but I would say it is quite a challenge to be able to get this in place. Then once the project documents are all in place, then you go through an equity raise process, you go through a debt raise process. Export credit agencies play a big role to play. European Investment Bank has a role to play. So there's lots of entities that will come together. I mean, we're looking at probably, 30 different companies between the suppliers, the customers, the debt, the equity, 30 different parties that have to be involved in this. So it's quite enormous, but definitely can be done. So with that, in summary, I just wanted to say that we are really excited about the market. Despite the challenges, we see many, many companies just going through this process, trying to make it happen. As you saw, the rate of return, this is not huge margins here, but it's important that we all do our part to ensure that eSAF gets off the ground, that we can solve this climate change little by little. And so it's going to take governments working together with eSAF producers, working together with airlines. You also have fuel distributors in the mix, renewable electricity providers, grid operators, et cetera, to come together and make sure that we say, okay, this is important. Now is the time to act. How do we get through this? And then let's go. So if you'd like some more information, follow us on LinkedIn. You can also visit our website, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have about this.
Thank you so much, Amy, and I see how enthusiastic you are related to the business and the consequences of doing nothing. And be quite clear here, doing nothing is the only option what we cannot use for the future. And this is something also what brings me to a question, and thanks for that. And one of the audience people said, one of the main barrier of the financing of eSAF is the price offered by airlines, which is too low for investors to commit. Do you see positive evolution over the past months? Are airlines willing to move forward or just waiting for public supports? I could ask you, Amy, but we have here Jan Pechstein from Lufthansa. We pass over the role to them because we want to discuss not only from a producer side, we also want to see from the side of the airline what they are thinking about our market and the part. Thank you so much, Amy. I would introduce now Jan, and I'm really looking forward to have you on the panel later on because you know exactly where we are in the market and how we're gonna bring this market, let's say, to a first FID, hopefully with the project Endor. Thank you so much. Now we from Lufthansa. Jan Pechstein is in charge of emissions management at the Lufthansa Group and is responsible for emission targets, SAF and environmental policy issues in this context. He started, very important for me, as a pilot at Lufthansa and maintains his license in addition to the management function. In addition to pilot training, Jan has a master's degree in aerospace engineering and has just defended his doctoral thesis on the topic of climate protection in aviation. The show is yours, Jan, ready for takeoff. Clearance is paid. Please start now.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to present here. Yeah, I was asked to hold a presentation on Lufthansa's strategy regarding the handling of sustainable aviation fuel. And I chose a rather technical presentation that addresses the challenges and also our concerns around sustainable aviation fuel, besides the many opportunities it brings. And regarding the opportunities, I would like to take a step back and draw the larger picture of how we use sustainable aviation fuel with regards to our emission targets. On the left-hand side of the slide, our emission target system is displayed. We originally started during the Corona crisis to commit ourselves to reach CO2 neutrality until the year 2050. And we also added a second so-called net emission target for the year 2030, which was to reduce our net CO2 emissions by 50% compared to our base year 2019. As the name says, CO2 neutrality and also net emissions, these were targets that were based mainly on climate projects, the financing of climate projects. And we realized that our ambition should be more stringent, and we should focus a lot more on intra-sectoral emission reductions. And this is when we started to assess the target framework of the so-called Science-Based Targets initiatives, or as I abbreviated it here, SBTI. The Science-Based Targets are an initiative of multiple international organizations that help industries to define meaningful climate protection targets that are based on a carbon budgeting approach. And the carbon budgeting approach that we chose corresponds to a so-called well below 2-degree temperature threshold for the world, and it was then translated into reducing our CO2 emissions per revenue ton kilometer between 2019, again the base year, and 2030 by 30.6%. So you see it's a specific target. It is kind of the emissions that are still allowable for a certain production unit. A revenue ton kilometer you can imagine as being 10 people being airlifted over the distance of 1 kilometer. Rather abstract, but this is how it goes. And when we translate this target framework into our strategy towards the year 2030, we are shifting the sides of the slide now. I'm moving to the right-hand side. You can see our base year 2019, the CO2 index 100%. Then there is a certain growth, and then come the reduction levers: fleet renewal, ops efficiency, and sustainable aviation fuel. I almost forgot to say, within the Science-Based Targets initiative, it is not allowed to use climate projects. You will have to reduce your CO2 emissions either by reducing your consumption of fossil fuels or by substituting the fossil fuels with sustainable fuels. And that's essentially what happens on the right-hand side of the slide. The fleet renewal is the biggest reduction lever until the year 2030 for us. It is replacing old aircraft with a high fuel consumption with more modern aircraft that have a lower specific fuel consumption. Ops efficiency means you try to operate your existing fleet in a more fuel efficient way. And last but not least, the light blue column, the sustainable aviation fuels. This is where we reach the yellow line. The yellow line corresponds to the science-based target, and below the yellow line, but not in the focus of my presentation, is still the net emission target system that is based on offsetting climate projects that we are sourcing through the system CORSIA and on a voluntary basis. In the light blue column that says SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuels, there can be two different categories, or it will correspond, it will be based on two different contributions. One is driven by a, let's call it, compliance market, or by the regulation, which translates into mandates for airlines. The other is a voluntary demand by our customers, and we try to make sustainable aviation fuel offers very attractive to our customers so that they voluntarily purchase them. But let me start with the mandates, the principle we have discussed today a lot already. Fuel suppliers must blend sustainable fuel into the jet fuel that they bring to the market. And most prominently, we have discussed the mandates in the EU or by EU members, but currently also other countries around the globe investigate whether to introduce such a framework or not. The challenge for an airline dealing with a mandate is always how to preserve the level playing field among airlines. Because as soon as regulation is geographically confined, you may enter a situation that leads to competitive distortion. And the aviation business is more global than most other industries. It is essential to ensure a fair competition among the stakeholders on the market. And on the voluntary side, it's about making attractive offers to the customers. Most of our customers that buy a lot of sustainable fuel also have climate protection targets, sometimes also from the Science Based Targets Initiative. This can be, for example, professional service firms that want to reduce their Scope 3 emissions. The Scope 3 is where they report emissions from duty travel, for example, according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And we can enable that by offering trips on sustainable aviation fuels. The challenge, we have to develop a viable product portfolio that is attractive, and we need to enable our customers to claim the environmental benefit. And I have a deep dive for both of these categories with me. First of all, the mandate. We already discussed, we already mentioned it, suppliers need to ensure that a defined sustainable aviation fuel share is ensured in the jet fuel that is brought to the market. And the sustainable aviation fuel share is going to increase with time. It starts next year with 2%. It then reaches 6% in 2030, and it continues 20% 2035, 70% 2050. There is a sub-mandate for synthetic fuels, for fully synthetic fuels or RFNBOs starting in 2030. And the feedstock, we've also touched upon that, needs to comply to the Renewable Energy Directive. What we haven't mentioned yet today is there are already national mandates in place in some EU member countries. For example, in Sweden, but also in Germany. In Germany, there is a power-to-liquid mandate. And it was decided that the European mandate should supersede these national regulations, but that is still pending. At least in Germany, the PTL mandate is still in the law. And what we also haven't touched upon yet is the so-called flexibility mechanism. The flexibility mechanism allows the fuel suppliers, the obligated parties, to divert from the physical supply logic as long as they meet the blending target, the 2%, across all airports they supply on average. But there is a challenge associated to this, because the other European climate regulation that is relevant for sustainable fuels, namely the EU ETS, it is still tied to physical supply. So there is a sort of mismatch. If all the fuel suppliers now concentrated their fuel at one single airport, which technically would be possible, then only aircraft departing at this airport may claim the ETS incentive or may claim the sustainable fuel in the ETS at all. This needs to be resolved. But moving over to the right-hand side of the slide, the competitive aspects or the level playing field that I mentioned earlier. Sustainable aviation fuel is more expensive than conventional fuel. That's why fuel prices will go up. And I want to make two examples. The first one, which is based on a typical network airline in Europe, such as Lufthansa Group. A passenger starting his trip in Barcelona, wishing to go to Tokyo, has multiple options to plan his journey. One is going via Frankfurt, an intra-European airport, can also be Amsterdam, can also be Paris. Or the other option is going via an extra-European airport. In this case, it is Istanbul, but that can be Doha, it can be Dubai, it can be Abu Dhabi, for example. And for a typical round trip, so 4 flights, Barcelona-Frankfurt, Frankfurt-Tokyo, Tokyo-Frankfurt, and Frankfurt-Barcelona. In the mandate, 3 of these 4 flights will be regulated. In comparison to the flight via an extra-European airport, only 1 of the 4 legs will be regulated. And this results in price differences. And these price differences is what we call competitive distortion. And the competitive distortion, the price signal, may lead to a shift of traffic. The person in Barcelona will still fly, but just not via Frankfurt. The person will now fly via Istanbul. And with the traffic, also the emissions move out of the regulation, and that is what we call carbon leakage. There's also another setup, that's the diagram below it. Intercontinental transfers is what we call this traffic, going from New York to Delhi, for example. You can go via a European airport or a non-European airport, and again, 2 of 4 flights are regulated, or none of 4 flights is regulated. And this is still unresolved, and we will need to find a solution for this, especially when the blending ratios increase to 6 and to 20%. But now to the second dimension, the voluntary demand. We have developed a broad range of products that intend to make flying on sustainable fuel attractive for our customers. And on the left-hand side of the slide, the B2C segment, we have offers all along the customer journey, from booking via the flight itself, even reaching the post-flight. The passenger has the chance to book sustainable aviation fuel. And we are very proud to say that we are actually the first airline to introduce a true green fare, so a tariff that automatically includes sustainable aviation fuel. In this case, 20% is always in a ticket when you buy a green fare. On the corporate customer side, this is basically where we started. We have the bulk deals as perhaps the major product. Bulk deals means that customers can decide on a certain volume of sustainable aviation fuel that we then source for them and incorporate it into our fuel consumption, passing on the emission reduction, the claimable emission reduction, to our customer with a certificate. And the certificate is what you can see in the lower right-hand corner of that slide. It basically states the volume of sustainable aviation fuel and the associated environmental benefit to provide, let's call it, an evidence to the customer that that fuel actually existed, that we've used it, and that the emission reduction can then be exclusively claimed by this particular customer. And we have an independent auditor verifying each of these certificates in order to ensure the claimability. We have a similar system with the Lufthansa Cargo, and we have flight-related sustainable aviation fuel offers also incorporated into our B2B setup. Interestingly, most of our customers show increasing interest in the sustainable aviation fuel itself. So the type of fuel and also the feedstock that is used, sorry, that was one too much. The feedstock that is used is of growing interest to them. We have already seen this categorization in the earlier presentations today. On the left-hand side, we have the biofuels. I chose my categorization by the different feedstocks. And on the right-hand side, we have the so-called synfuels. Often our customers are surprised that synfuels are not yet available at scale on the market, because publicity and marketing of other stakeholders on the market suggests different. But I have to start the slide on the left-hand side, because the only scaled process, at least at industrial scale today, is based on oils and fats. Usually, you don't use rapeseed as the picture suggests here. You usually use vegetable oils that had a prior use in the food industry, the so-called used cooking oils. But this often also includes a slaughterhouse waste, so-called animal fat. That's all summarized under the title used cooking oil, and is currently the major feedstock in Europe and in the United States when it comes to sustainable aviation fuel. A second option is you can also use sugar and starch, but you will always enter a food versus fuel debate here, because you can eat sugar and starch. Although there are also sugary and starchy residues from the food industry that become increasingly interested with other technologies than we had used before. We mentioned it earlier, alcohol to jet, for example, is a suitable technology to convert sugar and starch or their residues into sustainable aviation fuel. And last but not least, on the biofuel slide, we have wood and straw. Wood and straw is lignocellulose feedstock. And that has a very, very significant potential around the globe because there is a lot of unutilized lignocellulose feedstock. However, the technology readiness is the lowest of all of the biofuel technologies that can lead to the production of sustainable aviation fuel. So this is also not readily available on the market, but still it's a valuable resource, perhaps only as a carbon carrier, not so much as the as an energy carrier. Only if you say that biomass serves as the carbon carrier for a subsequent chemical synthesis to produce sustainable aviation fuel, wood and straw might be one of the most promising feedstocks. And that brings me over to the synfuel side of the slide, to the right-hand side, because when you use biomass only as a carbon carrier, you still need energy, and that must come from somewhere. And synfuels, or as the EU formally calls them, RFNBOs, renewable fuels of non-biogenic origin, they use, for example, renewable electricity as the energy carrier. That can be from wind turbines, that can be from photovoltaics. But still you need CO2, or you need biogenic carbon as the carbon carrier for the subsequent synthesis. But there's also another technology that is based on the direct use of sunlight, the so-called solar fuels. Solar fuels get rid of one essential step in the power-to-liquid or e-fuels universe, namely the production of hydrogen via electrolysis. This is not necessary when you drive your chemical reactions directly from thermochemically powered by concentrated sunlight. And the technology readiness is even lower, but still it's a valuable option to look into and shouldn't be forgotten when discussing the very ambitious scale-up plans that we have seen with the mandates, for example. Which brings me to my last slide. We as airlines, and I have indirectly received the question, I understood, what's your role in the value chain, dear airlines? And a part of the answer is within this slide. It depends on the positioning of the airlines, depends on the school of thought. Do we believe that supply is going to follow the demand, or do we believe that the supply could fall short? And then we have multiple options how to position. Most airlines currently buy their fuel based on short-term offtakes. So that is purchase agreements that runs 1 year to 3 years, sometimes with the option to prolong for another 2 years. You can do that with SAF as well. However, you then have very limited choice of feedstock. You can just buy what's on the market. And there's also limited choice of the technology, and perhaps sometimes even limited choice of the suppliers. When you believe supply could fall short, you can decide, do we position with long-term offtakes? Long-term offtakes are contracts that run over 10 years, sometimes 20, even 30 have been proposed. Usually these long contracts are there to ensure the business case so that a production facility is actually realized. In that case, as an airline, as a customer, you have the choice of the feedstock, you have the choice of the technology, and you have reliable supply. You have secured your own supply or your own access in a way. There are also multiple examples across the industry, but we heard it before. There is an issue with technology lock-in, or let's phrase it differently, is it a first mover advantage or a first mover disadvantage? Because when you log into this technology and be the first of a kind with such a production facility, you also log in the highest production costs in this conversion route. And this is a strategic assessment that is required. Last but not least, vertical integration. Vertical integration would mean you co-invest into the production facilities. You buy assets with your money. And with these assets, the fuel is produced. There is even more of the technology risk and the lock-in with you. However, you have transparency over the cost basis, and you have reliable supply. There are very few airlines that do it, but we have those examples already in the market of vertical integration. And what is important for me, do not mistake this for SAF ventures. Sustainable aviation fuel ventures would mean, and there are also many examples of airlines in the market that do this. This means you invest into a certain production concepts, you invest into perhaps the intellectual property, but your money is not directly going into the production assets. We've done that also as Lufthansa Group. We have invested into Synhelion, one of the technology providers in the field of solar fuels that I had on my slide earlier. And with that, I can hand back to you, and we have time for questions.
Yeah, and thank you very much for this fantastic and very detailed presentation, and for sharing with us the views on an airline of the SAF market and its regulation. And I think we have time for another question which came up. You talked about the regulation and the different regulations, and one of our participants in the audience asked, how does the philosophy of regulation differ in the EU and the rest of the world?
Which is a good question. Basically, the EU, well, sometimes it is called the carrot and stick differentiation. In Europe, the regulator chose to go with mandates, so kind of enforcing the demand for a certain fuel type that has environmental benefits. In the United States, it is fundamentally different because the regulator there chose to go for incentives. The Biden administration put forward the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act also brought tax credits for the blending and now the production of sustainable aviation fuels. And besides that, the United States, at least in some of their states, have so-called cross-industry transfer regimes. This is where you can, where you exchange environmental properties with other industries in return for a financial support to reduce the price difference for sustainable aviation fuel. And in practice, this results in a much lower sustainable aviation fuel price in the United States as compared with Europe. And that is a fundamental difference that also has implications for the sustainable aviation fuel market and regarding the sales success of the sustainable products that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you so much. I believe this would also be a good topic for our panel discussions later on. So thank you very much for your presentation and for being here. Thank you. So to complete the picture, after we have heard from a producer side, from the side of an airline, we are now coming to the view of the oil and gas industry and how the impact of SAF is. We have here Holger Haff from Uniper. As we know, Uniper is an international energy company that generates, trades and markets energy on a large scale. Their self-defined goal is to provide reliable and sustainability energy solutions for their customers. Holger Haff's focus is on green fuels made with green hydrogen, especially SAF. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Also, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, Uniper as a utility company, I think it's quite important to understand where we're coming from, what point of view we have. And I start with myself. So I'm an economist, so if later some technical, if I don't pronounce it correctly or don't bring it to the point, please, sorry for that. I started in 2007. At that time, E.ON Ruhrgas, it was a natural gas company, gray, of course. Biomethane was already available, but that wasn't a big issue. I was in this area, or doing some flexibilities, later switching to the area of selling and buying flexibility. And with that, in 2019, I had the first case that I was sitting together with a counterparty, and the counterparty suggested, hey, have a look at this project, it's hydrogen. And it was quite interesting because when I went back into the office and I did some scenarios, it was the first time that a few of the scenarios had black numbers, not only red ones. So why I'm telling that? Because that is also something, the story of Uniper, founded as a spin-off in 2016. Sorry, 2016. It's great. It has coal-fired power, so focus on power, coal-fired power plant, gas-fired power plants, also aqua and also nuclears, but also natural gas, so just a normal standard utility company at that time. When we had this spin-off, it was also clear that we have to decide where we want to go into the future. And at that time, we also realized, and it was clear, that it has to be green. So green power, it's easy. Like we mentioned before here, PV or solar or aqua power. However, natural gas has also to be converted because that's also CO2 emission. For us, it was clear that hydrogen is one of the possibilities, and we focused on that. We have already a history to that because in 2014, we started with the first project in Falkenhagen where we produced hydrogen. And with that, we got the experience. What are the obstacles to providing the right energy in the right amount at the right time? To bring also the hydrogen to the customer. At that time, we put it into the natural gas grid. But with that, we figured out where the obstacles are. And when we look now at the hydrogen and when we look into the future, for us, it's clear either you have the area where there is the demand of it, or you have the area where the power, the green power, is low cost available. Very often, it's not in the same time. So we have thought about it and realized that in the market, there is the possibility that you can bring the hydrogen in here via pipeline because the natural gas pipeline system is available. You can convert it and use it for hydrogen later. But then you're also limited. If you cannot use the pipeline grid, you have to go and use something else. For us, ammonia is a possibility. And with our project in Wilhelmshaven, we convert ammonia, or we will convert ammonia into hydrogen and put it then into the grid. But what will happen if you are at a place where you have low-cost green power and it doesn't make sense to produce ammonia, or much better, if you have a good source of carbon close by? Then we go and say we can make either methanol or SAF out of it. So what I want to say with that is, we as a utility company, we're going away from the green power and what you can make out of the green power to bring it to the customer. And SAF is one possibility we focus on. Why, maybe one more element, why we see us enabled to do that. If you look here at the slide, you see that we have different areas. So we know power, that's the core business we have. However, we have also trading, and trading implies also for us that we take care of biomass. We have a biomass desk, we have a we have also a coal desk to provide the coal for the coal-fired power plants, but we have also an LNG desk. So trading in the sense of bringing a physical good from place A to B where it's needed is also one of our core business. That is the reason why we go to this project, Skyfuel H2. Here in the north of Sweden, because here, like Amy said before, we have more than 90% of the power is in the grid is green, so we have availability all the time. We have a big power portfolio up there, so we can manage it well to bring the power there. And also important, like mentioned before, close by in the north of Sweden, as you can see here in the picture, there's a lot of biomass. Of course, for this project, we focus only on the RED II compliant biomass, which is left over of the trees. So with this project, we see, or we have as core competences the power. We have the part to provide the feedstocks in the most efficient way and also as needed. And we see that it's, of course, it's a new technology, like Amy said, but it's something which is already available and done for many decades. So we believe that is something we can do because it's very similar to manage and operate a power plant. With Skyfuel H2, we also went into, it's not a pure e-fuel, but it's also not a pure biofuel because we use both. And with that, it goes in the biomass, which is renewable, RED II compliant, and it goes in green power, which is renewable. With that, we create the syngas, which is then going into the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, and then later back into the refinery to distill it and to get the SAF and the naphtha out of it. Waxes are also, but we put it into the process again, so we have only these two outputs. With that, we went a different way than usually because it's neither only bio nor e-fuel. And the reason is when our innovation department checked on the possibilities to produce e-fuels, they realized, or also our market analysis team, they realized biomass could be a scarce feedstock in the future, and therefore we checked on possibilities to find the most efficient way to use the carbon. Because if it's scarce, that means the feedstock price will go up, and therefore the price of the SAF will go up. We don't want to have that, and that's why we focused here on this project to have it on a most efficient way. The goal with that is to have a lighthouse project, of course, and to build up a portfolio, which means that we have, this is as a first project. Later on, we can copy it and bring it to other places. However, we have always this trade-off, because the bigger you go, of course you have economies of scale. However, you have to bring in the feedstock. And here it's because it's biomass, you have to find a way to find the optimal for cost to bring it in, but also the CO2 footprint you have if you bring it in. Because at the end, we want to have a project which has a low CO2 footprint all over from the well to the tank. And therefore, the projects we have in mind, the future projects, they will also be limited to 100 to 300,000 kilotons per year of production. Yes, done. For Uniper, I put it together, is what is it we want to do? We want to go for a portfolio. Here, the Skyflow H2 project is a lighthouse project, and nevertheless, our SAF desk, which is the team who is taking care of all the SAF within the Uniper Global Commodities, they look for to enable our own projects, the ones we have, but also other projects, meaning that we are, for example, an off-taker, or that we participate in a different way. With that, on the supply side, we will have different sources of SAF, also with different qualities. Of course, it can be biogenic, or it could be e-fuel only. And with that, creating a portfolio that is exactly the core business we do as Uniper. Whether we look at the power side, the natural gas side, the LNG side, we always have portfolios. Why that? Because with that, you can generate additional value and reduce the risk. It's just a normal portfolio approach. And that is the goal we have also with these green fuels, especially here with SAF. Meaning, it enables us that a direct link between a project and the selling part is not necessarily needed, or at least we can substitute. Why? For example, if this project has a hiccup, and the production is just down for a week, 2, 3. What will happen if there is an off-taker who needs the SAF now? This, if we don't have a portfolio approach, there's a link, no SAF will be delivered. However, with our portfolio approach, we have the capabilities, the ability to substitute it and deliver the SAF from a different source. So for us, a portfolio is the essence for this e-fuel business, because without a portfolio, there is nothing we really see to bring additional value to the market. That is one part. The other part where Uniper has quite a huge advantage is that we have a long experience to have long-term contracts. Like just mentioned by Jan, many off-takers are used to have short-term contracts, which is 3 months, maybe a year, maybe 3 years. And if we talk about these projects, we have to finance it, and therefore we need about 10, 15 years, which is not common in this market. We have these contracts, so we know also 40 years contracts, and we know what has to be in these contracts in case there is something coming up between the parties. We know what it means if there are obstacles commercially outside, and how to solve them. And this knowledge we have from the long-term contracts, for example, on the natural gas side, or on the power side with the tolling agreements, or with the power plants itself, enables us to have a long-term contract with elements to reduce the risk of an escalation later in time. This is something we really are looking for to implement and also to bring into market, because that is really helpful and enabling to ship around obstacles. Obstacles. So what is the obstacle for us? At the end, without FID, without financial close, there's no project, clearly, as mentioned before. To get that, what does it mean? It means one task, for example, our team and myself have, is to find off-takers. To have off-takers which have exactly the same term means if we have a project which needs a financing of 10 years or 15 years, you need also an off-taker which has the same period of the same term. Also the other elements, for example, the feedstock. If you have a power or a biomass, what is the price linked to it? Is it something which is fixed? Fine, that's nice. Like Amy said, it could be on a risk premium because it's not common in the market. Or is it something which is floating over time, which means if the input, the feedstock side is floating, also the output is floating. Because, like Amy said before, any project has to be low risk profile as possible. And if there's too much risk, at the end there will be no FID, because also our board will not agree with that, or later then the financial close will not take place. So these these elements are important to figure out and to find for each party's role who can take which risk or who can manage the risk best, and without that there will be no project. So to summarize it, we have a history to bring in or to do the basics, the feedstocks on the power side, on the biomass side. We also know the logistics for that, to bring then the power or the fuels to our customers, and then to have portfolios which enables us to bring additional value and services to our customers, whether it's security of supply, whether it's risk reducing, or whether it's low cost. Yeah, that is the end. I hope I could show you a glimpse from the point of view of a utility company. And if you have further questions, don't please hesitate to come and ask.
Thank you so much, Holger. And it's not the end. We have questions for you.
Oh, cool.
It was a really interesting presentation. In particular, very interesting to understand that you are prepared to enter into long-term offtake agreements, because this is an important piece in the de-risking of such a SAF project. Yep. So very good to hear. There are other questions which our participants have raised. For example, what portfolio synergies do you see for Uniper in the future? Mm-hmm. And why did Uniper not go for 100% e-fuels?
Okay.
Very straight questions, I know.
Okay, I'll go for the first one. Synergies. Like I mentioned it before, for us it's green power, hydrogen, ammonia, or the other route with carbon, methanol, or SAF. These commodities, these fuels, especially if you look at these e-fuels, are linked. Like at the beginning of the presentation, you have seen the different types, how you can produce SAF. And for example, one way is also methanol. And therefore, we have the capability to use the different portfolios, whether it's ammonia to crack it and to make hydrogen, whether it's methanol and then produce SAF, or to produce directly SAF. That is all one portfolio for us, which we manage, and enables us to use the price differences and the availabilities. That's quite important in the physical market. You need it now and not later or just on paper. You need a physical good because it has to go here, for example, with SAF, it has to go into the wing of the airplane. If that is not possible, then you have a problem. So we see these portfolio effects on this high level if you look at different portfolios as one element. But also within one portfolio, for example, the credit risk. If you sell a long-term good, like here SAF, then you have a credit risk. You have to know that the partner on the other side has the capabilities to pay the product you sell. Also for us, because the customer believes that we will deliver this good for the next 10, 15 years. If this is not available, then you have a problem. With a portfolio approach, this is possible. The second question was about
the 100%.
Yes. So this SkyFuel H2 project, as I mentioned before, is based on, or the core idea behind it is that we use the most efficient way for the carbon, because we believe it could be possible that in the future biomass could be scarce and therefore could be expensive. If you have a most efficient way to use this carbon, then you have a price advantage, a cost advantage. However, we also look into pure e-fuel because we as a utility company, carbon dioxide is something we are looking into, whether it's possible to trade or not to trade, to help to our customers to decarbonize. And if this is available, also as mentioned before, that direct air capture is cost efficient in the sense that it's available, then I think we will see quite some developments, and then power is the core, the core feedstock, and that is our core business.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Good to have you here. Looking forward to the panel discussion with you, and thanks again for this fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
So the last presentation, before we start with the panel discussion, will be held by Margot Touré from Sky Energy. And Margot will deal with the question how SAF certificates can play a role in reducing the carbon footprint. Margot is the lead on claim reporting within the partner engagement team at Sky Energy. She's responsible for Sky Energy's partnership fulfillments of SAF and oversees the supply allocation and associated emission reductions of organizations with a footprint from aviation. Sky Energy is a market leader in sustainable aviation fuel. The company was founded in 2010 and has worked with airlines and corporates across the globe in their mission to achieve net zero emissions in the aviation industry. Margot, thank you very much for being here. Good to see you again. And I hand over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to speak to you on behalf of Sky Energy. So as mentioned, my name is Margot Touré. I'm a partner engagement manager at Sky Energy, which essentially means I look after our SAF buyers. We're purchasing SAF currently on the market, and that we're aiming to grow these partnerships beyond just a commercial collaboration. So it's a pleasure to be speaking about this topic today. And thank you for the invitation. I had the honor to meet Dirk and Christian a couple of weeks ago, months ago in Amsterdam, where we're located and headquartered. So it's very exciting to be talking to you today on this. So previous speakers have talked about a lot of things, technical basics of SAF, SAF policy and regulatory frameworks, how everything works. The current state of the market was also addressed and mentioned. You learned about SAF production, different pathways, technologies, and the role that SAF can play in different industries, namely airlines and also oil and gas. So in this last session, the last one but not least, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to walk you through what happens at the end of the supply chain. So once the SAF has been produced and is ready to be delivered on the market, how can stakeholders who benefit from aviation in their activities, their commercial activities, in their own supply chain, are able to take part in the industry's aim to reach net zero by 2050. But before diving into it, let me tell you a little bit about Sky Energy and who we are, if you don't know. So as mentioned, we started nearly 15 years ago as a very small organization, getting interested in the topic of SAF, but it was not even an industry at this point. It was barely mentioned as a potential solution for aviation. Now we've grown tremendously. We're operating globally, still based in Amsterdam, but we have offices also in the US. And we're working on our own production. So we aim to become SAF producers by the end of the decade. And we actually have 3 projects under development that are well underway. The first one being in the Netherlands, based on HEFA, waste oils and fats pathway. We also have another project based on alcohol to jet, and a third one, power to liquid, so PTL. So really trying to tap into that and become producers ourselves, and experiment with different production pathways and technological pathways. But in parallel, we've also been supplying SAF ourselves to aircraft operators, and we've provided companies with SAF and SAF claims through our strong connection, global connection with SAF producers around the world who already have volumes available on the market. So we've been able to service these customers along the way. In 50 years, we've also acquired quite some knowledge on the SAF topic in all areas: policy, technology, you name it. We've touched upon it in some way, shape, or form. So we've developed our own advisory services on the SAF topic as well. So available for many. To this date, I believe we've supplied over 50 airlines, 50 corporates across all continents, and that includes Antarctica. So we've been there for a while. And last but not least, Sky Energy has positioned itself as a sustainability leader in the space. We try to handle the most sustainable fuels as we can, using the most efficient routes, and we follow the guidance of our very dear independent sustainability board, who is a bit strict on us, but keeps us sharp and on our toes, and provides us guidance on the feedstock, our own projects, development, our production projects, on the fuels that we trade, policy implications, social impact, and our growth strategy. So they've been around for quite a while, and that would be NGOs like Solidaridad, WWF, a couple of universities as well, the Environmental Defense Fund. So they're all there to advise us on how to remain a sustainability leader from an environmental perspective, but also in terms of social impact. And I believe still to this date, we're the only B Corp certified SAF supplier in the market, and the largest team in the world dedicated to SAF only. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why SAF? That's a really good question, right? Why would we even bother to discuss this topic? So as you may already know, the aviation sector currently represents 2 to 3% of global emissions, which doesn't sound significant, but if we don't do anything about it, it will grow tremendously. We expect if unchecked, emissions will reach up to 1.8 gigatons by 2050. Like many sectors, aviation has set a very ambitious target to reach net zero by 2050. But how can we make this happen exactly? So one main solution to do this, which is actually not highlighted in this graph, is to fly less, right? It's the most effective way to immediately reduce your impact related to aviation, and it's the most effective. But we understand that this is not as realistic to cut emissions and to stop flying, so we need to provide other alternatives for the sector. So we anticipate for aircrafts manufacturers to provide us with more efficient aircrafts that require less fuel. So this will have a direct impact on the emissions. We also anticipate for offsets and carbon capture to contribute in some capacity and compensate for part of the footprint. We also expect for new propulsion techniques like electric aircrafts or hydrogen-powered aircrafts to play a role in this emission target. However, we do know that they will have their limitations when it comes to the length, so they will mainly be a factor for short-haul flights, and their technological sort of capabilities will be limited when it comes to long-haul flights, cross-continental, for example, which leaves us with SAF as the remaining solution. And as you can see from this graph, it's expected to be the largest, greatest contributor for achieving emission reductions in aviation and this target. If we were to compare SAF to the fossil route, currently with the SAF available on the market, we can reduce life cycle greenhouse gas emissions by between 65 up to 94%, which is quite significant. So not only is SAF expected to be a major lever for our 2050 ambitions as a sector, but it's also a solution where the impact can happen now, today in the short term, and it's currently happening. So if we really look at SAF at the molecular level, it's similar enough to fossil-based fuels. So it can be used in current aircrafts. So we don't have to change an entire fleet for this. It's also, appropriate for the engines, and we don't require much infrastructure or change to accommodate for this solution. So it's there and ready to be used. And as a matter of fact, to this date, over 800,000 flights have already flown on SAF. It is safe to use. So to that capacity, it's a very realistic, reachable solution that can be used by many. And SAF can be delivered in several ways. Next slide, please. So there's the typical traditional physical segregation, which is similar to the way fossil kerosene has been supplied so far. Just basically applying the same processes as a fossil kerosene supply chain, but for SAF. A more commonly used approach is where SAF we use the sort of the mass balance approach. So SAF is blended to some capacity with fossil kerosene. And this is quite common because SAF to this day receives certain certifications, namely by ASTM for safety reasons, and requires a certain amount of blending to be done, up to 50% on all aircrafts. So this is the current reality, but we expect for modern engines to run on 100% SAF without an issue. It's more there for preventative reasons and to accommodate for these older engines that are still circulating today. So those are two methods, but what I'd like to focus on in this presentation is the book and claim approach, which is the most commonly used approach today. And it consists in decoupling the physical products from its environmental benefits. Much like green electricity that you would be maybe purchasing in your house to sort of address your impact, we can do the same with SAF. So we can calculate the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions reductions achieved with a certain amount of SAF, a certain volume compared to fossil, and then basically separate the physical product from its environmental benefits. It's the most commonly used delivery mechanism. It's the standard today, and it's what has enabled us to stimulate the SAF supply, SAF capacity, what we call sort of the quantities of the SAF quantities that are produced today, capacity, and the market in general tremendously in the last few years. So how does this work exactly, and what are the benefits of book and claim? Why would we use it? Next slide, please. So SAF as a green alternative is typically 2 to 3 times more expensive than fossil kerosene. So when we purchase SAF under book and claim, what the end user actually pays for is the price difference between fossil kerosene and sustainable aviation fuel. They're really the ones who enable us to, instead of using fossil-based products in our aircrafts, use this greener alternative. So in turn, the ones who financially contributed to this replacement are also the ones who get to claim the emission reductions achieved with the SAF, and in turn satisfy their own climate ambitions. So typically for an airline, it's simple. They have emissions related to their fuel consumption of an aircraft. So this would be your typical Scope 1 buyer. But we also have companies, corporates, who use aviation in their activities when they fly for business, when they ship their products, either upstream or downstream. So these are your typical buyers who have an impact or emissions related to aviation indirectly, but can also pay or contribute to purchasing SAF and enabling more capacity. So the book and claim system really enables for all parties to share the costs of this more expensive product and to phase out the use of fossil in the aviation sector. One of the great things about book and claim and this mechanism is that it's completely location independent. There's actually only a handful of places around the world where SAF is currently produced, and it would be incredibly inefficient if every person or organization who purchases SAF gets to receive the SAF in their aircraft at their point of where they're flying. So what we do is we try to make that more efficient when it comes to costs, to time, to emissions. So the SAF is typically delivered at the most convenient location at an airport that facilitates blending and storage of the SAF. And that, of course, prevents us from emitting, from shipping that product to a different location. It saves us time, it saves tremendous costs, and a great advantage in that sense. It's also a benefit as it's not governed by fossil jet fuel supply contracts. So we're really contributing to the phase out of these fossil-based principles, processes within the sector and within the buyer's supply chain. Through book and claim, we're also able to achieve greater transparency on pricing. And it truly enables access to SAF to many, many more parties, individuals, companies, you name it. They're able to pay for that premium. And they're actually the ones who have been driving and driving this market so far on a voluntary basis and enabling companies like us to develop our own projects and make sure there's more SAF available for all. So they really truly help accelerate SAF supply and SAF production. So what does an airline or a corporate actually buy when they're purchasing SAF? You can already anticipate that they wouldn't be receiving the SAF physically at their home as in a barrel, for example. So what do they receive when they actually buy something? Next slide, please. So when SAF is purchased by an end user, through the book and claim system. A company like ourselves would typically supply the SAF, so physically handle the fuel that is being delivered on their behalf, and in turn provide the customer with some documentation which shows exactly what happened and how their impact was achieved. So this can be done in two ways in this market. One is through a registry. We're seeing more and more of these being developed and trying to learn some of the lessons from other sectors at carbon markets to develop SAF-focused registries. RSB is one of them, so this is the example that you see in the middle. There are others that you're seeing more and more that are still under development or aiming to achieve more maturity. We ourselves, as a SAF supplier, have been performing this type of work for many years now and providing customers with their own claims and giving the same level of detail that a typical registry would give. So really going into the full supply chain, so giving a lot of visibility to the customer who is purchasing SAF, full transparency on that supply. What kind of feedstock was used? Are there any sustainability certifications or compliance that this SAF adheres to? What is the full life cycle of the SAF? And what is, in the end, the sort of the greenhouse gas emissions disclosed? And of course, the final carbon savings. So this is typically a SAF claim or a sustainability claim. There are several ways to sort of name that document, but this is a document that the end buyer, end user would typically receive after SAF was physically delivered and accounted for and reported for. One thing that is very important in this whole process is to be sure that the SAF is properly accounted for. And when we do that decoupling of the physical product and the emission reduction claims, we want to make sure that the sort of the allocation of scope 1 and scope 3 claims is done properly, which is why we go through a third-party audit through RSB, which is the organization, the reference when it comes to auditing and checking on inventory. So this is why we're able to be a RSB certified operator in the market. And this is a very important step to avoid any type of double use of claims from the customer side or issuing double claims by mistake as well. So a very important process, part of the process. And there is some guidance available for any company, airline who's looking to perform purchases under book and claim. There are two main sort of documents to refer to, one being RSB's book and claim manual, which provides some guidelines on how to use book and claim. And the World Economic Forum Clean Skies for Tomorrow initiative has also, Sky Energy was part of writing this document, which sets a very clear framework on how to account and report on SAF claims in companies' extra financial reports as a standalone disclosure. This is documentation that's publicly available, and I'd be very happy if you're interested to share a link to these via email. So please let me know if you're interested, and I'd be happy to follow up on that. And that's about it. I think time is up. Thank you for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'll be sure to share my email afterwards if you're interested in receiving these documents.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to have now this round all the experts on the table. And I saw a lot of the parts what you have presented here. We as a financial investors are asking exactly the same question. At the end, if you produce 1 ton on this kind of SAF, what you produce actually is a 90% value of a certificate. And the other one is the kerosene. So we are much aligned, and we hope that we can bring this kind of explanation what you have, the role of SAF certificates now into the next level, because we believe this could be a market also from the financial perspective, how we can handle it, how we can potentially also trade it, and then it could be a new way of bringing this market to the next step. Thank you so much. Margot, we would now and love to have you also on board with our roundtable. So we do a little bit of a roundtable. For all the participants in our webinar, we need around about a 10 minutes break in order to make a maintenance setup change here. And then we see us back in 10 minutes fresh on air in order to explain from the different aspects and faculties what we do now all together. Thank you so much. We hear us back in 10 minutes. So welcome back to everybody. So the last 30 minutes, we tried to make a little bit of a television show, not so exhausting like in politics, because in principle, we have the same view of the market has to be changed. The only thing is how we do it. This is now the question. In the next couple of minutes, we just go around and see the different faculties to see what kind of solutions they have, what kind of obstacles they see. And I would hand over to Dirk in order to see the first question coming from the auditorium. And I think it goes then.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I think the first question is to you, Jan. It says, I notice that Jan is not addressing the additional costs premium of SAF. Does Lufthansa see a business case for its voluntary SAF, and do they expect to be able to handle the premium cost for the mandated SAF?
Well, I think I addressed this, but let me state, this is one of our greatest concerns, the price premium. SAF is very expensive. And we have incorporated the fuel into our sustainable product portfolio, which I showed on my slide. And part of the truth is that only about 4% of our customers book a sustainable option. And the remaining over 90% don't. From our sales organization, I know that the demand from the air travelers is shifting into regions where there are incentives, for example, into the United States. There you have the tax credits, you have the cross-industry transfers that reduce the price premium that airlines pass on, and therefore the airlines in North America have much greater sales successes. And this is part of the challenge that needs to be resolved. So we see a business case. That's why we continuously expand our product portfolio. But the price premium is a challenge. If sustainable fuel is not subsidized or not incentivized, it is too expensive for the broad customer range.
Yeah, let's see it from a different perspective. So we came today about the regulatory part, but also from the technology part. One participant today asked to you, Amy, for us, always very important question. How commercially proven is the technology of Arcadia? How many hours of operation? But the logic is, how commercially proven is the technology of the typical process what you have prepared?
Wonderful thing about what we're doing, everything is a TRL 9, so technology readiness level scale is up to 9. 9 meaning completely commercial. So everything is a 9 except for one piece, and that is the syngas reaction. And that is because we're using electrically heated components. So that piece of the puzzle of the process is a TRL 7, which means it's running at a pilot scale, but not at a commercial scale.
Important to see if we're going to swap over into these certain kind of technologies. But now, Max, I think you see so much of the market. If you would have a chance or a possibility, what do you think, if you have a wish, what would be would you think is the role of an airline in scaling novel SAF production and like eSAF? What do you think from SkyPower side? What should the airline do from a CEO perspective? What is their next step?
I think the next step is really to consider entering long-term offtake agreements, but obviously addressing the concerns that Jan has mentioned, because the price premium is just huge, and therefore ideally coupling private sector premium demand with public support mechanisms. And I've already mentioned earlier how public support could enable the, companies to actually enter long-term offtake agreements. And I think one of the most powerful mechanisms that we have seen for first-of-a-kind plants out there is the H2 Global mechanism, where a market intermediary actually sits between the fuel producer and the final offtaker and can cover the price premium achieved through a double-sided auction, so auction on the supply side and an auction on the demand side through a CFD mechanism. So the market intermediary would cover a certain extent of the, or even 100% of the green premium, and at the same time take out counterparty credit risk. I think that would be quite powerful, but obviously is not a long-term solution. But at least if we're talking about first-of-a-kind plants, that might be a very impactful solution.
Thank you so much. From our perspective and from the situation, what we see in the market is very clear. The next couple of years will be the most critical ones, because if we cannot bring and scale up in the next years, as you said, we have to deal with the consequences out of that. The question, what we would also see from our perspective, and I look now to Holger. What do you think from Uniper's side? What are your obstacles to get to FID related to your points? What do you think, what would be your next steps, what you would need as an ingredient to come to an FID to your project?
More or less, it's exactly the same. We have the obstacle. There's a project, it has to be financed, we need FID, and therefore long-term financing, long-term offtake agreements. Without that, it doesn't work. And for that, we have to find solution who's taking, that is at least our approach, who's taking what risk, and then figuring out what risks are left and how can we treat them, tweak them, and find a solution. And that takes time and a lot of effort and ideas. And hopefully we will find solutions. But at the end, it has to be a match, and the risk has to be clear on each side and also clear how to handle them.
Thank you so much. From the perspective, from the technology, I think what we learned today, if you see SAF, it is not rocket science. So I have not heard that we said, but this product will not produce or cannot be produced because we have never done it. I think this is clear to everybody. The question is now how much eSAF we have, how much SAF we have. The technology of eSAF is definitely something to scale up. And we think, and this is also the question, so to say now, from a logic, if we have low costs of electricity, and if we have a certain technology standardized, what is Amy doing, so to say, to have really a standardized product, what you can double, triple, and so on, this should reduce the costs. From that perspective, Amy, do you think this is one of the key elements to not start each project from scratch, but have a standardized box available and just adapt it, limited to the new location side?
Yeah, so that's definitely been our approach. I mean, the development costs are so expensive, right? So if you can reduce those development costs for subsequent sites, that makes a big difference. It also reduces the time and money. So I think that's really important. You're right, though, finding sites with renewable electricity that's affordable is challenging in Europe. And, I really would hate to see that projects get produced in the US or Middle East with lower renewable electricity, but then are imported into Europe. It's a shame to see. I think we've seen that on the wind and solar industry, where solar panels were produced in Europe, actually a lot in Germany, and then now they're all produced in China, right? So I think we risk the same approach if we're not careful. If the EU regulators are not careful, we'll be having e-fuel production somewhere else, and then shipping that into Europe. So that's challenging. But yes, in terms of having a site standardized, that makes a big difference in cost.
Thank you so much. I think, here's one.
Maybe to add, I think you just mentioned it, Amy, that also on the power side, right now, all the developers are looking more or less for that what is known, what is needed. So all these eSAF plans are maybe planned, but not really in the heads of the people who plan that. So therefore, they have to also to realize that their one facility, 300 megawatts, that's a lot. That's really a lot. And for that, you need also the capacity on the production side. And like Amy has also with her project, there's CO2 needed. We don't have an infrastructure for these volumes of CO2. Also, that has to develop. And I think if this is kicking in, that we have infrastructure and supply side on the feedstock, then we have another step in decreasing the costs. So first, the quick ones, quick in the sense of 2-3 years, that you can scale and you have a reduced cost in the double the project, having a second time, but then on the long term, also on the feedstock side, a decreasing cost. I think that it will come for sure.
Thank you so much. I think here we can definitely go into a lot of details. We don't have a banker now with us in the round because the bankers will explain us what is not possible. But on the other hand side, the next step from our perspective would come. Also related to the certificates. Margot, I think very well done to explain that the certificates could help us out. What do you think? What would be the main reason for corporates to look at certificates as a solution for their greenhouse gas emission reporting? What do you think here about this instrument?
So, of course, corporates can play a great role in stimulating demand and signaling demand to production producers out there. But from their perspective, many companies around the world, more and more, have set ambitious climate targets for themselves, namely under the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which clearly basically they're setting commitments for themselves to reduce under certain scopes a certain amount of emissions related to a baseline, which is usually the year when aviation was at its peak in terms of emissions. So companies have a real challenge there to address that, and they've publicly committed to do so. So they need to act upon it. And SAF is a great way to reach those targets. It's not considered an offset. It's actually more of an inset where emissions are addressed within the sector where it's happening. So it's one of the key arguments for why corporates would be interested in taking part in SAF. For the purpose of this discussion today, it's also a learning opportunity for a lot of companies who are financial institutions, technology providers, legal firms. A lot of these companies, actually, most of their emissions come from business air travel. And not only could they use SAF to inset and reduce their impact, but they can also learn from it, understand the product, understand how it's being used and can be reported on. They can also lead by example and show their customers, their network, their shareholders, that they're leading by example and walking the talk. So all of these are good reasons why companies would want to take part in it now, and why they would want to acquire knowledge from it and get closer to the industry and look into ways to invest more in it in the future.
Thank you so much. I think, yeah, Jan?
If I may react
Sure.
to this.
Jan, please.
Yeah. I'm also a big fan of a book and claim approach. What I would say, though, is right now, the book and claim concept is not accepted by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this certainty, first of all, has to be provided. But even if we have that certainty, it also has strategic implications for us as airlines, because if a corporate customer that is actually flying with Lufthansa now procures CO2 reduction certificates by a third party, then what happens with a long-term offtake that Lufthansa has concluded? We might not be able to pass on the price premium for sustainable fuel that we have contracted to our customers because they have decarbonized elsewhere. And that is a risk that also needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Understood. I think here the market goes in the one or the other direction. So we also love to have this kind of certificates from a financial perspective somehow included. What we have, or what shocked me a little bit, is how you showed us, Jan, how we could, let's say, fly around the globe by not paying. From a regulatory perspective, what do you think, Max? Is this know-how already addressed somehow in Brussels, or is it like in the German tax law that we say one law gives different other options to come around and ship around, or do you think that Brussels sees this area of concern what Jan has shown us today?
Well, I certainly see it, and the issue I see is the following: the regulator, or in that case the legislator, the European Commission, has obviously not fully thought it through, and this is by no means a hard criticism. It's that there's the good picture of regulation is throwing a rock into a calm lake, and it will produce waves, and some of these waves are unwanted, so you have to throw in another rock and another rock and another rock. So that's the way most regulations work, and I like this picture a lot because it actually explains that with every regulation you will see certain unwanted outcomes, as you have perfectly described, Jan. That might have been just an oversight, that might have been an issue which someone said, well, it's not that relevant. I don't know, I wasn't involved in the legislative procedure. However, what we quite often see now with the pressure the EU Fit for 55 program initiates on the entire market and the entire economy is that the legislator hurries legislation up to an extent where we see outcomes which might not have been fully thought through. And the issue with that is if you influence the economy like that, economy will act in the most economic way. That's what economies do. And that means that if there is that there might be ways to just avoid the scheme, which may be unwanted by the regulator, but are perfectly legal. And that's when we then came to more regulation, even more regulation and more regulation. So I see it a bit of critical when these issues now come up. Let's see what the European Commission does about that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Max. So it's clear to all of us we can only act in a certain kind of a framework. Jan, you as the airline representative, let's do a little bit of a math. We have done this with green steel, just as an example. If you want to buy a green car, let's lose a Tesla, and it costs 100,000 euro. The price for using not only the battery green, but the increased price to get green steel around the chassis of the car, it's around about 1%, 1.6%. That means if you go into the car organization and you say, I want to have this kind of an add-on, or you want to have green steel, it costs you around about 1 to 2% at the moment in the pricing, only the change. If I have the chance to go to Lufthansa and say, I want to have an eSAF, or according to law related to, what is the price increase now? Is then Ballermann gone? Is then means Spain cannot be used anymore because the price is 10,000 euro? Or what do we discuss here? What is the price element for a typical, let's call it economic flight, if you have to fulfill these, let's call it corporate, regulatory conditions? What do you expect from?
First of all, it's not only the Sustainable Aviation Fuel mandate. Fit for 55 also brought a tightening of the EU ETS, so that is kind of a combined cost burden. Yep. And then obviously it depends on the route that you are flying.
But not through Tokyo, or?
to Tokyo is not in the ETS, but to Tokyo is the sustainable aviation fuel mandate. And the price tag, the regulative price tag, if everything out of Fit for 55 comes until 2030, it can be more than 100 euros, and in 2035 it's more than 200 euros. Additional price per ticket for the flight, as I showed it, from Barcelona via Frankfurt to Tokyo. And that is compared to 10, perhaps 30, 40 euro price increase via a non-EU hub. And this is our concern.
This is what we are discussing.
Yeah.
So this is what we have to explain somewhen to the third world, where we are in competition about the pricing. So it's around about the 100 euros area, what we have for one round flight, if we are really coming into this position.
Yeah, in 2030 then. Yeah.
Do you think that based on this additional claim on the pricing, you will have no growth anymore at Lufthansa? Or do you think it will be adapted and will be, let's call it, just shifted away from other areas from the consumers, and they just say, then I don't use so much of A, but I want to fly and I pay the green premium for the Lufthansa?
Well, you're talking to the engineer, not to the sales expert. But what the colleagues told me, what the colleagues from our sales organization told me, that a price difference in the order of magnitude of already much less 50 euros may trigger passengers to choose a different carrier and to choose a different route. Okay. And that has so significant strategic implications for a network airline like Lufthansa. I mean, an airline that is only operating within Europe, that is not so much concerned with all this. But for a network airline with a hub in Europe, this is a significant strategic concern, because our average contribution per ticket, the money that we actually earn with the ticket, is in the same order of magnitude or even less than that on average. And therefore, it's a significant challenge that we are facing. But I would like to end on a positive note. There could be solutions to this. Yeah? There are regulations that are geographically confined, but still non-distortive even in aviation. One example is the German aviation tax. The German aviation tax is based just on the final destination of the passenger, regardless of route, regardless of carrier, regardless of number or location of intermediate stops. And if you let's assume we collect a levy based on the same principle. Everyone who goes to Tokyo has to pay 40 euros for sustainable aviation fuel, regardless whether he's flying via Frankfurt or via Istanbul, Dubai, or wherever. Then the money would be collected in a competitively neutral way, and we could use these funds to finance the mandate, and then it would be competitively neutral. I truly hope that in the review process, such options will be assessed and introduced.
That means we have to fly you together direct to Brussels in order to get these ideas. So we support you here. We have, let's say, because we are running now into the area of the end, but very important, I just saw that also from Tokyo, we had a partner here, and he just said, oops, this is sometimes really interesting. And he said, just to confirm, the regulation, what we discussed, also applies to Japanese airlines using European airports. Is that?
That is correct, yes.
That's correct.
If it's if the airport fulfills the requirements for to be included, i.e. a major airport, then yes, that would also apply to a Japanese airline
as well,
departing from that airport.
Yeah. Confirmed. So I'm not quite sure if Tokyo is still alive in means of awake always regarding the time change, but we bring this also back to the partners. We have a lot of much more questions available. We will go through it and give also feedback here to the auditorium. I think now we come to the last 5 minutes, and normally we have a so-called last round. If you could have a wish to this, let's call it beast of a market, only, let's say, with 1 or 2 sentences, what would you wish about in which direction should the market go? What would you need as an ingredient? What would you say, I need a subsidy and the cheapest EPCs, Amy? So who take care of that? Just a little round. And I would start here with Antoine. If you have a wish, what would you want to have from the market?
I will be a bit cynical, and I have two wishes. The first one is that air transport is actually getting more reasonable, and I think this is one thing I kept on hoping for when I was working at Airbus. I know my Airbus friends still think about when you see these expansion numbers, you don't really know what to think. On the one hand side, you think, okay, I can sell more aircraft. On the other hand, you're thinking it's actually not a nice outside. So I would be hoping that air flight is keeping maybe this level or even going slightly down. Yeah.
Thank you so
A
much.
bit cynical.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting. From the Uniper side, from your side, what do you think? What is your wish into the market? Selling only Uniper production? Hopefully not, Amy. That a little bit of Arcadia is also available.
So first would be what I realized personally, that not everybody in the market is so clearly and understands that SAF is needed. Very often we have talks where we realize, do you know the regulation? Where we have the impression that we have to teach them that there's something coming up, and that's scary. So the whole market is not there yet. So that would be already helpful. Why? Because then it was also increase the pressure with all the problems you mentioned and all the other problems that are there, that they go to the place where it can be solved, which is in Brussels. Otherwise, I'm convinced there will be solutions. So that's why I'm not wishing for it, but I wish that everybody is pulling in the same direction.
Margot, do you think, if you have a wish, how Sky Energy could prosper from the market? What do you need as a next step? What is your wish to the market?
Well, for Sky Energy, the mission is very simple. It's to develop more capacity, more SAF. So we really need that demand. We need to de-risk our cases. We need that willingness to pay for SAF. I think the most sustainable SAF possible is actually my answer. We know we need to scale up capacity, but we want to do that in the most sustainable way. So that means really identifying the geographical areas where a business case makes most sense, where feedstocks can be used to their maximum potential, where the commercial sort of viability of a business case is there. I also think we should increase access to SAF, so of course under book and claim, but I wish for us to really aggregate that demand and use it as a way to develop more capacity and strengthen our projects. And that means, as mentioned, creating more certainty on how to account and report for SAF. There is some guidance out there by SBTI, who has recognized book and claim, but I'm sure we can do better, as mentioned. So these are my wishes, but I think it's just a matter of time.
Thank you so much. To Amy, you wish financial close as soon as possible, or is anything before that what you want to have from the market?
Yeah, well, I wish for the whole, just like Maxime said, we need the whole industry to get up and running. We need multiple e-fuel plants getting to FID. And I believe the only way to do that is for the EU government to step in and give some kind of revenue certainty, contract for difference, some kind of way that these e-fuel plants can say, okay, the government will step in and buy the product. We know the price that they'll buy, and then these products will take off. It's similar to what the U.S. has done with the Inflation Reduction Act. You have that revenue certainty. You can meet these $3 per kilogram hydrogen credit. There's an SAF credit in the U.S. But I would really hate to see that all these eSAF plants get built outside of Europe. So having the EU government step in with some incentives and revenue certainty mechanisms, that would be my wish.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Amy. And I definitely agree on the parts as well. Max.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that would also solve Jens and Lufthansa's problem, because then the prices are reduced from day one, and then that makes everything so much easier. So the whole market works if this type of thing would be put in place by the EU governments.
Yeah, Jan. Max, from your perspective, from Sky Power Initiative, if we sit together from the CEO side in 1 year, let's say, what is your wish? What do you think? What should we achieve? Where is it? We have the first FID of 1, 2, 3 projects, and what do you think? What is your wish for the next year for this market?
I think that covers it actually quite well, because we are really at a make or break point here. I mean, if we are looking at the long-term picture and we want to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, then we need to be at the market tipping point in the early 2030s for eSAF. And therefore, we really need to demonstrate some level of success. And that means FIDs for the first couple of plants until 2025, so end of next year. And I think we need to be creative in understanding what's possible in that time frame, and at the same time also look at the longer term perspective. But if we purely focus on FID until end of next year, I think we also need to acknowledge that some things will just not be feasible. For example, changing EU regulation through the Commission just takes longer, right? So if SAF allowances can only be changed by 2027, how can we actually change that through coupling it with national government contributions, for example? So I think those creative ideas we need to start getting into, otherwise this will be really tough.
Thank you so much. Jan, you have to fly. That means what is the right way to bring you on sustainable SAF? What is your wish here?
My wish, regarding the regulation, I think we've covered this, restoring the level playing field.
Yeah.
But in the end, basically, I reword what everyone else has said. We need to reduce the price differential, be it through economies of scale, through technology advances, through incentives or smart financial mechanisms like the H2 Global that we have mentioned earlier, in order to increase the uptake. The value chain doesn't end at the airline. It also extends to the airline customer.
Okay, thank you so much. Very, very, very impressive. Yeah, from the regulatory perspective, any wishes? So not more laws, but more doing.
I earn my living with more laws, so no wishes in that regard. No, seriously, I think clear guidance from the European Commission on whichever regulatory way they take, and then don't leave us in the market alone with finding out what the regulator actually meant. Because at the end of the day, in my perspective, the market can live with each regulation, some better, some worse, as long as it's clear. The worst thing which we can expect from a regulatory perspective is open questions and unclear guidance. And if we have to tell to clients, look, one way is possible, the other way is possible, in the end of the day, the European Court of Justice will decide in 10 years, that's the worst of all worlds. So please be clear in whatever you decide.
Thank you so much. Before I head over to Dirk to say the last famous words, also from the financial industry, what we realize if we speak with our clients, all the clients want to have a cooked deal. That means the financial close deal. But if all the private market participants wait until this project come, no project will come. That means please be serious also in that part. The financial industry, we are only an allocator to that market, needs certain elements to have the chance to invest in a sustainable product like eSAF, also in the development side. What we have done now with Arcadia, what we have discussed, Hensley, this money is definitely worth to speak about from the capital markets, because to have the banks in place at financial close, that's clear, but equity takes the role. So thank you so much for all of you that you shared your aspects and so on. And I would hand over now to Dirk to say
the last famous words.
For the last famous words, exactly.
Yeah, it was a really intensive and also long afternoon, but we thought it makes absolutely sense to show the full picture to the audience and the full supply chain and value chain of the SAF market. So therefore, thank you very much for participating in our webinar. And hope to see you all soon in a follow-up. And if you have in the meantime any questions that we couldn't answer here on the panel, please reach out and we are more than happy to discuss. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, have a good flight back, and Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.